There we go. Hey, everyone. Hey, guys. Hey, Jesus. I realize that the format that I'm enjoying for this series and I'm enjoying trying out is a little bit like actually how Rush Limbaugh does it. He has a stack of stuff, right? I heard him remark that like he can't really make notes, even if he has a talk at a place, which he doesn't do too much, but he just basically talks. And that's the only way that works for him. I do think I'll probably make some things that are reasonably structured after I'm happy with kind of a spontaneous one. But I'm enjoying doing it this way for now. You know what's interesting? There's a book called Persuasion Engineering. Because I could have been putting this in a Google or Amazon, but it's by Bandler, Richard Bandler, who is one of the two guys that created neurolinguistic programming. And what's interesting about the book, and it's worth reading, she got a lot out of it, but it also illustrates it. It's almost like he dictated it verbally to somebody because it particularly has no real structure to it. And he just ends up telling a bunch of stories and talking about concepts, but it's particularly clear that it just had to be spoken, like, and then pretty much transcribed and not even, and maybe edited for grammar, but not structured. And it's a totally appropriate book. Oh yeah, cool, exactly. Yeah, I don't think it's on a lot of people's reading list. But yeah, and shockingly helpful. And it's really a lot like how I normally talk, but certainly how I'm doing this series. And it's something I've said in a lot of different ways, but when I think of that book, and then if you think of plenty of books you've read, like nonfiction books that are structured pretty clearly, then um, there's nothing really about the structure. You forget most everything regardless, right? Unless you go through it again and build on it and so forth. But I learned at least as much and applied and improved at least as much, if not more, from Persuasion Engineering than even other good books. Oh, it was a live event that was transcribed. Okay, there we go. Okay. Oh, like Frog Spritzes. Okay, another book that Bandler wrote. Their original thesis was called The Structure of Magic, I think 1 and 2, which you don't really want to read it. It's pretty, I got it, but I never really got all the way through it. It's pretty academic and just not really written for consumption. It was like the paper, like the thesis or something. But good book to read. So that point of reading the book is useful, but then it's quite a lesson in how structure isn't really particularly relevant. Certainly, exactly. Yeah, Tony Robbins I can't remember if he learned, I think he might have sat directly in one of their seminars that they did, right? Bandler and Grinder originally. And Tony really applied it and made it particularly practical and marketed it well. And I got a lot from Tony. A lot of the specific suggestions in NLP don't work like super well in terms of like learning a lot about NLP isn't going to necessarily transform you into a great sales letter, right? If I try to stick a bunch of NLP into the OMG sales letter, it's not going to change the conversion. Maybe there's people that would do that and it would, and then they would say it was NLP. But the model of NLP is excellent. The map is not the territory and so forth. It totally helps shed light on things about the mind and such. Anyway, that's just some thoughts. So I end up with kind of a stack of stuff in a sense for each of these webinars is the way it, practically speaking, works. Julie said, I have now been through Crushing the Game 1 at least 5 times. Oh, cool. That's what Fletch said. And the 4th time, I honestly felt like I was listening for the first time. Amazing, as I had taken copious notes the first couple of times. Yeah, that's fascinating to me too. It's really quite something. Yeah, and on my end, yeah, I need to go through them because I tend to forget approximately like what I actually said. Remember the general topics. And there's a coherence, of course, to what I'm covering, obviously, and I know what I'm talking about. But I don't have a clear memory of each thing. Although if I go to say something again, I tend to know that I said it before. All right. And another thing that we tend to be doing in Crushing the Game is we tend to be shedding some specific light on conversion and sales. Conversion and sales is something where I probably mentioned this, but I just want it to be fresh in our minds. We don't want to think of it in terms of being a person just generally being good or not. The same thing with like money or sports. Like people have different pieces of the puzzle, different, in one sense, different specialties, but even a specialty can cause us to miss the mark. Like someone's specialty could be like web copy or phone sales or cold calling. But even then, people just have like different strategies, tactics, and meta strategies they've figured out. And you really can learn a ton from people, obviously, with conversion and sales. And of course, it's one of the topics that's interesting to me, and that I've developed a number of specific tactics for in life, along with several role-playing games and romantic relationships and a few other topics. Magic, the card game. So there's various things I've delved into. That's one of them. And since we have a mutual interest in that, you guys and me, then it works well as a thing to work on tactically as we take a look at meta strategies, which is the main thing that we're trying to do. That's all coming across. Wow. Wow. 6 times. Jeez. I better listen to it again and see what the heck I did. Steve says, Mike, I'm curious to know what is the most amount of times you listen to one of David's recordings. We need to have an entry in the Guinness Book of World Records, number of times listening to David's. Was that the old after game back in the day, or is this the new stuff? Cotton surprised me years ago with my original Law of Implication series, where he said back in 2015, it must have been about after about a year being an OMG, I think. Maybe he said early 2016, I'm not sure, but said he'd been through all the videos, looked webinars and stuff by like Greg and Fletch and such. And yeah, like 3 times, and then my stuff like 7 times. Yeah, 6 to 8. Exactly. Go to webinars buffering. How are you guys doing? It's good on your end, Mike? Yeah, it might be specific to your location and connection and stuff. Okay, Bryce. All right. Let me take a look at a slide I made. Yep, good. Okay, looks like the consensus is good. All right, let's see here. All right, let me take a look at the slide. I'm going to spend most of my time with the Facebook group up, I think. But I've been thinking about talking to you guys and thinking about the idea, and then thinking about talking to you about it. So this has to do with meta strategy in general. And then when we're thinking about in meta strategy, what we're thinking about transitive strategies, right, that apply to various things in life, right? And another, just to ignore the slide, I had that mentioned in my post, in my comment on my post. Let me just go back to the Facebook for a second. Sorry, I can also get my train of thought. So with meta default, an interesting thing also about meta strategy is that you can learn about, let's say the main priority you're working on is growing your business, making it profitable. Then you can learn meta strategies that can apply to it in lots of other places in life because meta strategies are transitive. But relating to this whole topic of meta strategy, then we want to get into the question of how we see, which is actually similar to how we conclude. Oh, that's nice. Mike's red carpet conversion. Great compliment to what we're talking about. Money flying around everywhere. Exactly. Of course, Mike and I are constantly talking, so we're pretty good in sync with things, and that's an excellent series. I recommend people, of course. Okay, so let's take a look at the slide. First, I put and how do we see, have it in quotes. And then I wrote that seeing overlaps with concluding. So what I mean by that, and this will also start to give an indication of why this question matters so much in a very practical way. Like the fact that people tend to be bad at meta strategy protects itself, right? I remember I talked about the defense against the defense. This is a little bit similar, where bad meta strategy protects or blocks a person from realizing the importance of meta strategy itself and then seeking it out, right? And people by default don't really see context, and we'll see why that is as we continue. Therefore, they don't see how meta strategy matters, like these transitive greater strategies, because people tend to look with them rather than seeing them, and they're kind of always there. Any person's meta strategy that's good or bad tends to always be with them, right? Most fundamentally, the way that they see and think and conclude and feel like they know things, right? The way that they get certainty is with a person all the time. And so it becomes invisible. And then by thinking about it wrong, by having a way of seeing that that makes context invisible, that leads to context being invisible, then the importance of context isn't seen. And what the mind does is it sees the kind of, Mike called it like the glory hound, like the guy who, let's say, finished the relay race, right? Or we had an example in Magic, like where if you cast like particularly like a big creature and he like goes and defeats your opponent in that strategy card game, then it looks like that was like the most important thing, but there might have been a lot of other spells that weren't played and cards like that weren't played that were a lot more important, but that guy looks important, right? Or like the lead singer might look most important, like in a group, and so. So what we're going to be developing in this webinar is there's a mistaken view that if we skip down here, I wrote, does background, mindset, context, etc., does it tweak what we see? And this is generally how people believe without really thinking about it, is that mostly we look around and we see the world or an event happens to us. And when people think about mindset, what do people believe about mindset? People believe that mostly your mindset like has an effect on your results. It adjusts the results you get from an endeavor or might determine what's going on and things like that. And what I've been discovering even better lately, even when I talked live at the very first OMG Live, I harped on the idea of preparation and context and how people underestimate those things, the importance of it. And so my message has been consistent in that way. However, even just over the last couple of weeks, it's I'm seeing even seeing it with significant more clarity how we sin- under we underestimate in a circular way that kind of keeps us from realizing how much we underestimate it. And as we see this, what I'm talking about, and we stop underestimating it and we start understanding things properly, but how we see things. And when I say see things, I don't just mean visually. When you go to make a sale with a client or attempt to make a sale with a client or attempt to reach out to a client, attempt to get traffic, in your mind, you're seeing and concluding how to do that, right? If you make a sales presentation, that's coming from what to say, right? Like does it make right? Before you start the presentation, you see a certain thing and then what happens is from what you saw to say while you're talking, right? So everything you say comes from somewhere. If someone's dating, then how they see or don't see eligible people that they could meet, right? Like potential traffic, or what they see to say to somebody early on, or what they are seeing in their head, and then what to say and how to act on the first date, and et cetera. And then all that is an example of what we see, which obviously determines our results and so, or is a significant part, either determines it or is part of the whole mix. It's important. So there's a way that people tend to think that mindset, like that we basically see stuff as it is, and then mindset and things related to that, like our filters, our lenses, and so forth, adjust that a little bit. Maybe they change the tint and so forth. But what I'm realizing is that I wrote here that an onion illustration. If we start peeling away layers of an onion, where's the onion? Right? What happens is the onion disappears as we start to peel away layers, right? That in one way of speaking, there's no onion. In another way of speaking, there is the onion and it's made up of layers, right? But the onion doesn't consist really of a real onion in the middle covered by a bunch of layers, does it? The onion is literally made up of layers. And if you keep stripping away layers, the onion disappears. And that is actually the way it is with like your computer or even yourself, right? Your personality, a sales presentation, the reason why somebody buys or doesn't buy a product that you make, your service, and et cetera. It's not like there's a core that's there and that's real and that's slightly adjusted by like layers or filters or lenses. Instead, events, objects, theories, conclusions, and so forth, like what is made up of, it's like the end result of a bunch of filters and layers and context. And there is nothing in the middle. Like the middle, you keep peeling away until you get closer to the middle, at which point, if you finish peeling everything away, there's nothing left. So a sale isn't something that's affected by the other person's categories in their mind, their previous ideas, all of the filters and lenses and all of the factors in the context. It's not a thing that's affected by context. And nothing is a thing that's affected, a couch, a computer. None of these are things that we then look at with a lens or context. What they are all like onions in the sense that they're all made up of context only. They're real and they exist, but they exist like if you go to make a sale and the person buys or not, that really happened in a matter of speaking, just like an onion really exists, right, in its own way. but you can't separate an onion from its layers. And it really is the case, and I'll be looking at, obviously, to illustrate this, but people think and act as if there is a real thing there, and that maybe the context matters a bit and maybe it doesn't. Or like the broken windows theory of crime. People are always worrying that context matters more than they thought, but they never realize that the thing itself disappears if you keep peeling away context, that literally things are only composed of context. And again, our mind basically creates things as a representation of all, like the context is so complicated, right? It's like literally context ends up involving everything that exists in a certain manner of speaking. And so our mind has to start to represent differences and compilations and archetypes and averages of things and so forth as thing that we can feel like affect each other, and that representation matters. Representing things in an overly simplified way is helpful, as I mentioned last time. And I'm expanding on concepts I introduced last time. But there's a way that it's totally different when you so effective to quit thinking there's also a thing that's mostly real and it's causing stuff. Again, a thing is purely a representation created by your mind that out of context. Think about even a physical object like your computer or your phone. Think about how we understand it through science, right? We're made up of a bunch of molecules and so forth, right? So the idea of it being like when you look at your phone, you don't see or conclude that, okay, there's a bunch of molecules here. You can separately memorize that, yeah, if you stop and think about it, it's made of molecules and so forth. But that isn't generally your experience when you look at your phone, right? Or your computer. You don't think, oh, I'm seeing a bunch of molecules. So what your mind does is it actually comes up with something in the middle. Like you don't see all the molecules, so to speak, maybe all the molecules, but adjusted by context. At a certain point, the level of detail get totally filled in, right? Totally ignore the granular detail. And also a whole bunch of the context gets ignored. The fact that you're imposing color upon it, right? The color isn't inherent with the molecules at all, right? Color is fabricated, just even according to our normal scientific understanding. It's fabricated by our brain, like 100%. It's purely wavelengths, right? The model is that electrons are changing where they are in orbitals, emitting photons of light, and those can be of different wavelengths and frequencies, which go together. Speed of light constant, so it's wavelength times frequency, I think. But one way or the other, that has an impact. That's different frequencies are absorbed or affected different molecules differently in your retinas, and then your mind comes up with color from that, right? So there's no color even inherent within the object. So that's more context. So our mind both gives us a representation of things, or if someone does something to us, or again, this applies to, and I'll try to apply directly after I illustrate it this way, to events, or trying to get results, and trying to see how to get to a result, or a goal itself feels like a thing. Once we let things disappear, once we have a different context to our idea of things itself, where we have a radically different flexibility. And think about it. Think about whether people are flexible enough with adjusting their goals based on new information, right? What would it look like if people were properly flexible with goals? They would, first of all, never have goals for things that were in the past, right? As I referred to before. But in this context, I'm bringing it up in this way, right? So the very fact that people constantly have goals for things that are in the past, plus they'll have goals for stuff that includes things that are totally outside of their control, which if you think about it is nonsensical, right? The whole point of a goal is to give a sense of where to direct resources, right? Like it's inherent to the idea that something about you and your resources can affect the outcome, right? So inherent within a goal is that you have some ability to affect it. And so if there's some part or some aspect of a goal that's beyond your control, like how traffic is on a certain day, or whether a plane's canceled, or you might be good at sales, but whether a particular person says yes or not, that's all, there's factors outside of someone's control, but they still get frustrated by those things. They're still like part of the goal. So people set goals that include succeeding despite some factors being outside of their control. And plus they'll set goals for the past, right? They'll be like, I wish the past was different. Or they'll wish the present was different. They'll say, darn, things should be different. They'll talk about the present or how someone currently is acting or already acting like in the present as if that should be different. And that'll go along with having a goal for it. That's some level of priority for the person to feel like they want, even if it's just putting emotion into it, whatever it might be. There's Whenever you see so many errors like that, in this case, when it comes to how people deal with goals and flexibility and what their goals are for, then again, there's something people like Shema asked, how do you know if you're on the wrong island? When errors like that just pop up nonstop, and then if we try to just have it not do it wrong, and then the error still pops up, then something's wrong somewhere else, right? In the context that we're not currently seeing. So we need to figure out what it is. And I noticed this so many years ago that what was going on with goals was just error after error, right? Every time I get frustrated or bored, that would be an obvious example of an error, plus all these goals, plus the process that we would go after goals would often be flawed. And then people would constantly, in practice, be directing resources towards a goal other than what they seemed to be thinking their goal was. And then once I realized that mostly they were trying to prove themselves already competent or great or whatever, you reinforce their self-image. And then that people would direct resources to that to a great degree rather than supposedly what their goal was. Then that was eye-opening. But then even just telling myself or other people that wouldn't dissolve it. So that meant there's something deeper I had to figure out, right? But there are these symptoms. And so there was something wrong. And I went over what I just did last minute or so to also just show you a little bit about more of my process for how do you go about figuring out these meta strategies, right? And I could be playing a video game, and if I see myself getting upset or I see myself doing something ineffective, or if I didn't spot a tactic that I thought, how might I have done things differently? So I might have spotted that. And maybe realistically, you just don't spot everything within a certain time frame, right? But regardless, I would be doing something else and it would still shed light on the overall goal process, whatever I might be doing. You see it in relationships, you see it with kids, right? Having a small child sheds light on what's inherent within our original goal process, right? Before we learn to act as if it's not, to some degree, like not getting upset about small things and overtly and so. All right. So talking about goals and goal flexibility, right? And I was giving examples of symptoms that people's sense of flexibility with goals is bizarrely off, right? And how common is it for people to say, oh, I was expecting such and such as an explanation for why they're dejected, deflated, and so forth, right? But there's something obviously maladaptive about it, right? Oh, I was expecting such and I didn't get it. And therefore I'm deflated, right? I'm confused, demotivated, upset, whatever. When the right tactic in that case is dead obvious, and therefore there's something blinding. Whenever something is otherwise dead obvious and people aren't seeing it, then once again, we know something about the meta. We know something is blinding that. We don't conclude that overall they're a stupid person, that they're overall a sheep. Never, ever, this is important, never, ever generalize contempt. Again, this is another something I've said in a different way in the past, but I bring it up with a different angle now. Ever, if you're ever generalizing contempt and watch it, it comes statements like, these people are just stupid or that person's just incompetent, right? Or immoral or bad or whatever. If it's not the exact words you use, but if you look at the realistic meaning of what you're saying, and if you're generalizing that the way that like their stupidity or immorality or incompetence or whatever, specific judgments about competence makes sense. And we can see that by looking at the opposite. I had a moment, I might have shared this too, but I had a moment in college where I played tennis and I was like, okay at it, like high school, junior varsity, okay. But that's about where a lot of people that kind of play tennis casually are at. And so I could normally just play tennis with people if I thought they like tennis. And I'd say, oh, we played some time. They'd say yes. But then a friend of a friend was on the tennis team in college. I was like, oh, he just by reflex. I said, oh, we should play some time. And he said it really wouldn't make sense, like genuinely. And he was right. Like I just hadn't thought of that, but he would be so much better realistic that it just wouldn't make. Or it would be ridiculous for LeBron James to act like he didn't know whether he's better at basketball than me or something, or even an average NBA player, either direction with LeBron James or with me. So I just showed by making a clear and present contrast that it doesn't make any sense to try to be humble regarding a specific talent. Now, in other cases, you can't tell that you're not sure, right? With some of my friends who I would play tennis with, we didn't know who would be better, right? So we can also see that sometimes we don't know who's better at a particular thing, but sometimes we do. And it's not the reason that there's like a stigma or a social no-no attached to even making judgments about specific skills and stuff or who's better is because it's associated with or blend together with the two berries that I talk about, where they're not differentiated. And the problem with that, it's blended with generalizing a sense of who's better, right? There's often when there's contexts where if someone's better at something, then at least in that context, it feels right there that the person really is like better overall, right? Like at OMG Live, if someone's crushing it, or if someone's like maybe one of the owners of OMG or something, it can feel like that person's like better overall within that context. And of course, that's not the case whatsoever, right? But I'm just illustrating how within a certain context, or if you're at an Amway convention, the people that are killing with Amway, they're like, oh, that person's more respect, right? Whatever. But then you're in a totally different environment, it might be irrelevant, right? Or if you're at a tennis tournament, right, then the tennis pro is treated like, wow, they're like the big person we want to see. Or if you're at a concert and the singer, right, or the DJ is a big kahuna there. But there's a way that people tend to generalize that. And we do it in our day-to-day lives. We do it in those situations. Make sure I don't lose my train of thought about the competence. So we can, or about what I'm talking about here, talk about goal flexibility overall. But I stopped because I wanted to say how important it was not to generalize a sense just because it very much matters as a meta strategy. So we talk about you accumulate meta strategies. This is one of the meta strategies that you just want to have, and it's going to matter to you constantly. You can spot how other people do this, and they'll also assume that you're doing it, so you have to be careful. If you talk about how someone's great, there's a way that people really assume that you're elevating that person in general, right? And the more we tease this apart as a culture, the better off we all are, and that could take some time. But while we live in the world that we live in, then for yourself, also when you're just thinking about stuff and planning, and this comes up in the background, again, it's invisible, but it affects your conclusions a lot. Believe it or not, about yourself, other people, it affects your motivations. This idea of feeling confident in general. It's also another layer of the onion on dissolving this massive suck of resources that everyone spends on proving that overall they're competent, good person. And even if you think you have low self-esteem, you still want to, like people just, no matter where they are on the self-esteem scale, people put so much, limit themselves so much to take or are afraid of situations that might give them feedback that they're not overall in a generalized way competent or whatever, right? You can even get similar with this where by learning not to generalize with competence, goodness, skills, intelligence, smarts, all that stuff, all those kind of, all these kind of loaded ideas, then you can actually get good where you realize that how you do in a particular sales presentation doesn't, how well a particular relationship goes with somebody or whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to affect even your sense of confidence at making sense to client. Like one instance of what you do doesn't need to be generalized to how competent you are in general. And again, there's layers of the onion to this idea of needing results. I've talked about needing competence. It's a trap. It's a circular trap. If you need to feel competent in order to proceed or be successful, just to remind you, the one main part of the puzzle of how to get out is to, and because you have me, you can, or if you got just figured this out yourself or got it from someone else, if they had figured it out, then there's an overall meta strategy that I'm giving you and that I've told you about directly in the last couple of sessions. But there's an overall procedure about going towards your goals that involves both taking action and reflecting and thinking, and it's all geared toward probing and figuring out things like bottlenecks, right? Things that are headwinds and so forth, factors, vectors that will help, right? Semi-soft blocks, like certain achievements, milestones that you can hit that are gonna be pretty easy to hit if you focus it on it. And if you were gonna succeed anyway, then hitting that smaller milestone would give you significantly next higher advantage. I thought of another good example of that. I'm talking to Mike earlier today that I can share with you in a moment, but I don't want to have too many open threads at once or I get myself a little too confused. So you can get your sense of overall competence through meta strategy so that it's founded on a rock, right? And I just explained that roughly what I mean by that, which is the like understanding about looking for bottlenecks. And understanding about looking for bottleneck is another part of my stack of stuff that I wanted to mention today. You want to see, as we're talking about here, how it is counterintuitive to look for bottleneck until and unless you see why it doesn't happen by default, then you're going to stay trapped by the default. If you think you can just do it directly without the right process or method, it being looking for bottleneck. All right, I can even just stop and I have a note on this. Just imagine, for example, that you and three other people are working on kind of a business plan for a startup business. And you point out, wait a second, if we do this plan, then we're going to run into this obstacle is going to hit us. And suppose that when you point that out, you and no one else knows how to solve that. The way people normally feel in a situation like that is they're annoyed that you brought that up. And it's, why are you being negative? You're going to suck the air out of their enthusiasm and your momentum, right? If you say, there's this issue that we need to solve and I don't know the answer, especially if they already thought they had a plan, right? Most people's plans involve a series of steps that they're going to count on working, right? And then like literally they plan on hitting a particular step without bottleneck. So they plan on not having obstacles or bottlenecks that are unforeseen, which is particularly bad planning, right? But it's how people do it often. And literally you can see with this illustration, doing the correct thing of planning, which really what a plan should involve is you have a sense of what the circumstance would look like once you've succeeded. Like generally something that was a problem isn't, right? Or a flowing business, right? A business where there's a flow with product, potential customers and actual customers is what it might look like. And a plan should look like a method for probing, finding out like what product is going to work, right? Given the audience and what you can get made and so forth. And then like how you're going to go about figuring out what the issues are as you look for traffic, right? So you plan on not knowing, you plan knowing that you don't know instantly what all of the twists and turns and bottlenecks and things that you're missing and knowing all the answers to what you need to figure out are. And the plan involves how you're going to go about finding those things and how you're going to survive with morale and with finances, right? And so forth while you're figuring those things out. That's what a good plan looks like. But trying to lead people to a plan like that will generally result in you being like, probably just kicked out of the entire group, right? And disliked or people talk about you behind your back and just sneering at you or whatever, right? That kind of illustrates, if you buy what I'm saying, like if you think that's about how people act within reason, but you could probably massage that illustration for yourself or just look around as you live your life and see that's how people like it. Looking at bottlenecks you don't know how to solve tends to feel like a step backward or just unhelpful, right? And again, the fact that it feels that way is proof that by default, this isn't how people think in terms of looking at bottlenecks. They're going to feel wrong, right? Like my planning and actions feel wrong. Even it just takes years and years, if that, for it not to feel wrong to somebody. Me go about what I do. Like it might feel right sometimes while the results are there. And then other times I'll be doing the same thing, but I always do, and it'll look wrong. So if it doesn't look wrong by default, like at least to general audiences, then you might be suspicious of your own process or planning. All right, let's see. I got on some threads related to the goal flexibility. My overall thread here has to do with the main message, so to speak, that I was looking to do in this webinar is that we want to have a greater understanding of me by me talking and you working on in your own head and listening, and we'll continue as webinars goes on if it takes more than one webinar. But of understanding what I mean by things dissolve as they're really made up of layers of context. Oh, I was saying that that this is discovered in various places that context matters more than people thought. But what you want to discover, somehow context always matters. Always. Think of that word for a second. Why is it that that people are always discovering the context matters more, and they seem to never be discovering the context matters less? Two examples are like the broken windows theory of crime, which is the idea that by removing little input like indicators and triggers about crime, literally broken windows, right? In an inner city or any neighborhood, if there's a bunch of windows that are broken and graffiti and small crimes that are going on, then it tends to lead to more like greater crimes too. And that's like a theory of crime that's been apparently shown to work pretty significant, pretty over and over. So what is that? That's a discovery that, context matters more than we thought. Not just the glory hound of, ironically, the 3 strikes law has been, as I understand it, shown to like where the third felony and you're in jail for a minimum amount of time. It leads to all sorts of bad ripple effects. So when you focus on the kind of glory hound, like we need to be tougher on crime by putting people like for sure into jail, removing discretion from judges, then there's all kinds of bad ripple effects from that. You read about it yourself. I'm forgetting about what they are, but it leads to people not being charged with felonies when they otherwise would be. It leads to, there's a whole bunch of ways that just judge discretion would be helpful in ways, either sometimes with more leniency, sometimes with less. So the kind of going right after the middle, so to speak, is shown to be less effective than what people thought, right? Rewards and punishments to affect behavior. It works in the short term, but lo and behold, it doesn't work well in the long term, and it tends to backfire in many cases. Unless you happen to be rewarding and unless you end up using it to help a person dissolve issues. And then that's when it seems to work long term once in a while. But if you know how to see the difference of when it's going to work and when it doesn't, then that gets cleared up too. So constantly there's all these ways that, and one other example is, again, I was going to say all these ways that people rediscover that like instances where context matters more. And they're constantly also discover how the glory hound, the thing like in the center, so to speak, the most obvious kind of full frontal assault on the gates or whatever, is less effective than people think. They discover this over and over again in various ways. And what does that indicate? If people are constantly discovering that context matters more than they thought, then that actually goes along very well with what I'm saying, which is when you understand things even more properly, and it took me forever to realize that better. I used to think maybe it's 50-50, but really, again, an onion isn't 50% made of a core and 50% made of layers. It's just made of all layers, right? And so things are actually entirely composed out of context. There's another thing that I can get to at some point sooner or later where I want to show you how even like things that you're so sure are things, you only see them because they're triggered. They're already in your mind to be triggered. And then your mind builds the rest of stuff around that. But all seeing and in practical circumstance as a human involves something that's already in your mind at this point being triggered, which another thing that in its application can be very relevant for sales, shockingly. And that you can only trigger something that's already there. There's a lot of room to maneuver, even though that's the case, but there's still a certain part of the puzzle that helps to solve. I just had another thing here. Haha, glory. Example. This kind of just popped in my head with Carol Dweck's growth mindset. I just Googled growth mindset and got a definition and so forth. I'll just read this here. Carol Dweck's educational work centers on the distinction between fixed and growth mindset. According to Dweck, in a fixed mindset, people believe that their basic qualities like intelligence or talent are simply fixed traits, right? Like a kid who just thinks they're smart or stupid, and then other people are smart or stupid, and that their results are not based on effort or something you do, but just based on inherent quality, right? Those the same people that particularly tend to want government to make things fair. Right? But just like you'd expect, obviously, those people are not as successful than people that think that they can affect their growth and their learning by doing something about it, right? So apparently this is a massive discovery that took research and so forth, which is in and of itself shows there's a serious problem with people's ability to theorize if this type of thing has to be figured out with experiment. And the person has to be a professor at Stanford in order to popularize something like this, right? That people who think that there's a benefit to learning learn more than people that do not think that there's a benefit to it. Anyhow, this is yet another discovery of the fact that context, like what indicates this mindset, and she gives a specific aspect or part of the onion, right, about this growth versus static, fixed mindset matters for people. But it's over and over again, you'll find, and you don't look for it, that people are constantly discovering as if it's particularly clever. It is clever in a practical sense for people relative to if you don't know this. But once you understand this fully, then you look straight for it, where like a sale being made or not is fully made out of layers. Like I talked about categories and layers upon layers, which is why sales is a fascinating thing because you learn different layers from different people. Now you only have to get over a threshold, remember, when it comes to sales. So you don't need to have everything. You don't need to know everything about sales, obviously, to make a sale. But if you're not getting over the threshold, then it's really a matter of just figuring out what contextual layers, categories, et cetera, that you need to get right. And then at some point you'll get over the threshold. But fundamentally, that's what making a sale consistent. And what you'll do is you assemble more and more of a toolbox, not even so much of tactic. And you can have tactics that work. That's fine too with sales. But you start looking at realizing places to look. I'm going to give you some examples, some of which I've already given you, but just to give an example, we'll talk about with a client. Or I thought of a new one that I can start with, probably several new ones, but one's particularly interesting. It came up in a different context, different topic, but having the awareness, the mindset you could put in a sense of a filter for thinking about meta strategies is I didn't like when I heard this one example, then I applied it to other things. It had to do with my wife just remarked to me that, what was it? Oh, that people's, that I guess boys, like kind of general attitude. Oh, no, not attitude. Sense of the traits of women basically comes from, not that this is too profound, but it's the kind of thing we might not really think about without having it mentioned. There are traits about the way kind of women are really gets fixed to a significant degree in their young years, regardless relative to how their mother. Things like loyalty, like how like if they're kind of angry, right, or threatening, or nurturing, or different stuff like that. One thing that I noticed that was fascinating for me is that, and I do this by way of illustrating a meta strategy, not that I need to talk about myself for one, and a meta strategy that can be very relevant for making sales. My mom has a relatively Victorian mindset towards sexuality. And so I carried that with me in a sense that it would always kind of, I noticed it was a different world that I wasn't really, it didn't really, sorry, I'm struggling not to immediately hop over. I need to explain what I'm saying before I hop over and apply it to sales. Otherwise I'd interrupt myself and you wouldn't have my mental picture in mind. But it's incredibly applicable to sales. So at, let's say in the fraternity culture, which I wasn't a part of that in college, right? Or even in high school, there was like a party culture that I wasn't really a part of. There's a whole context involving parties and plus alcohol that where basically getting a woman into bed was totally differently possible and more realistic than I had any awareness of. And so it even occurred to me at some point, like late, it was probably even after college that, and this might just seem really funny to some of you, but it occurred to me that one of the reasons guys got women into bed so easily relative to how I imagined it normal, like it would be or was or whatever, was like alcohol was involved. And it's not that I didn't drink at all. It's hard to explain. I just like dates with me just really wouldn't involve alcohol. Not that we would go to places with alcohol and I wouldn't drink it. And sometimes they would, but a lot of I would just tend to just assume things that just didn't happen to involve alcohol. I just tend to do stuff in my life that doesn't happen to involve alcohol, not because I'm trying to avoid alcohol. Again, it's just not something I think about, if that makes sense. And then the things I do think of doing just tend not to have alcohol served at those places. I don't mean going to a choir in a church or something. I just mean going to a movie even or whatever. Or if I go to dinner, I weirdly just don't think about ordering alcohol. During my dating years, I just didn't have the money for that thing. or I guess most other people don't either, but then they go into debt. But alcohol is just expensive as heck, right? Compared to not ordering it. Take like a $20 dinner and turn it into a 50 or 100 or $200 dinner. And then it occurred, and again, so it's funny to those who take it more for granted or see it the other way. But the same thing is with sales is, and so I'm not making a value judgment on whether I looked at things rightly or wrongly. There's literally no value judgment plus or minus. I'm showing you how what's interesting is that how it was for me without even really thinking about it. On the other hand, my mother was generally a loyal person. And in fact, my dad and my mom are both alive and they're together. They've been over 50 years. And there's never really been a question of them breaking apart or anything like that. So it was easy for me to see women as potentially being loyal. And it isn't like none of this is extreme where I don't think any women would hop into bed right away, nor that I don't think any woman would be disloyal. But it's just like generally the way you feel about how things are, so that it's very easy for me to not screw up loyalty because I expect it in a certain way, right? If it's there, I'll see it, if that makes sense. Like for other people, whether mom wasn't really a loyal person in relationships, which is fairly common. I'm not making a value judgment about that. It's hard to explain. It's just if loyalty is not really a priority, right? If it just isn't really part of their thinking in a certain way, and it's easier than just break things off with people, then they'll look right at someone who would be loyal and not see it, and they'll take themselves out of it. A lot like people can look right at a potential sale and not see it. But with me, I can look right at a woman who would hop into bed with me, or especially if all I had to do was give them some alcohol or take them somewhere with alcohol, right? Then, and again, and literally again, there's no value judgment plus or minus in any way when I'm saying this. I don't just mean I am making one, but I'm pretending not to. I'm just really not, right? But I'm talking about it in this kind of level way because I wouldn't even normally talk about it, right? But it's such a good illustration in parallel to sales that I want to share with you. Because for people where asking for $4,000 a month or $2,000 a month or whatever, or even asking them to be paid for doing a service, it can feel uncomfortable to some people and they don't even know it's happening. They don't know that it's like me with my mother who was loyal but Victorian, relatively. I'm just using that word to just not get too descriptive. But so in one way, I would see something that was pretty adaptive when it came to loyalty. Now you might say, David, it could be maladaptive and that maybe you would expect people to be loyal who wouldn't be. In my case, it really was just adaptive, just like someone whose mother was a lot less Victorian would, just in my overall context. I also was just my social group just happened to be more people that believed much more in holding off with sex and stuff. So it was, but then it's circular, right? You get it reinforced because you tend to hang out with people with similar mind beliefs and so forth about things. And again, it's like a circular, a little bit of a bubble with any of these things. But when it comes to sales, you could be doing like almost everything else right, but be so blind. Oh, because the thing about these layers of the onion is that what we know overall from so many little symptoms that I won't get into for the moment, it would be too much another threat, but that but when I talk about evolution as an example, people can be smart. We need to have some theory about the mind and people and their smartness and their ability to go after goals and think, achieve, and so forth that allows them to be both smart, like surprisingly smart and shockingly blind or stupid at the same time, where we don't generalize in either direction, right? Like a person who believes in evolution, if we generalize that person is just a real stupid person overall, that doesn't really fit the fact, and it's condescending and it's ridiculous in a number of ways. But believing in evolution in and of itself, just for that one area of life, it's very stupid. It's so far away from the scientific facts, theoretical facts, and so forth, that it's totally normal. And I understand how it happened based on normalcy, but it's very stupid. But at the same time, those same people can be very smart in other ways. And it was a very eye-opening in college to see both. And the way I look at the world, I really got something out of that because I didn't generalize one way or the other. I realized I was ruthless and I had to figure out how people could be both genuinely at the same time. Whereas normally people just turn up their nose and just think everyone's stupid that disagrees with them. They do the two berries together instead of teasing them apart, like over and over as a meta strategy in life. It keeps them blind. Anyway, and the main topic here that I'm talking about with the sales and what we see And I'm relating it to like boys and their mothers with dating and how that can color. And it colored it so much in the context they're totally not aware of, right? I had a friend who felt like parent of the girl he was dating wouldn't like him. I didn't feel that way. That was another thing I had in my favor. I felt that by default, they would generally like me. On the other hand, I feel like strangers by default don't want to talk to me. Whereas I have some friends, various friends, who don't think that, right? It makes it much easier to meet people. Sometimes there's things in life where there's pluses and minuses, right? Ultimately, that varies though. And if you tease it apart more and more, you can get to both. Because some people just really don't want to talk. Learning to tell the difference is ideal. But I would tend to assume that parents would like me in it. And when you're dating, that's actually a fairly important part of it. Not like super important, but fairly important. And I was able to communicate to one friend and explain that because he thought that he had to take them from inherently disliking him to liking him, which is like the kind of thing in sitcoms, right? Where the guy tries too hard and it's just like trying too hard on a date with a girl, right? You try too hard with the parents and it backfires. Instead, I was just like, just smile genuinely, shake their hand, look them in the eye, and mostly just talk normally and don't say much and don't try to impress them. And pretty much you'll come across like the ideal man, if you don't have a nose ring, right? And so forth. Mostly parents are just relieved if there's no like bone to the guy's nose and so forth, if he's a ploy, depending on your age or if he's in school. So again, just different examples of things where people are blind to one thing or don't see something because of a certain filter they don't even realize is going on. And again, what we see is ultimately fully made up of these filters. So when it comes to sales, you could learn all kinds of scripts and tactics and mindsets and get a whole bunch of things right. And it's real, and there's still things that can fully blind you. And that's where I got on the tangent about, or not really a tangent, it was related, but the example about evolution and so forth. There's these filters can also be totally blinding at times, depending on the layer of onion can completely blind somebody, including it can blind your prospect, right? If you're in the wrong category, like you're an other rather than them, they can be completely cut out of wanting to buy from you, right? So some are really all or nothing. This growth mindset thing with Carol Dweck, it's useful in that it's one of the kind of all or nothing things, right? If a person fundamentally doesn't believe, obviously, that learning can do anything for that, like attempting to work or learn can do anything, then they're obviously not going to do it. That's why in the results formula, belief is part of the formula, right? Focus, desire, belief that I gave back in 2012 or 2013, because not believing that you can achieve, not believing there's a path is a full block. However, I'm still talking about something separate. Although the related thing here was that in general, some filters can fully be can be a full block and some aren't, right? And you also want to distinguish when it comes to dating, when it comes to making a sale with client consulting, some things are determined by the rest of the context. How you dress, there isn't one right way to dress, but it should be part of your message. Like what you can have is a conflicting frame. If you're trying to fit the mold of a professional in the vein of someone who would dress in something like a suit or close to it, a suit might be overdressed no matter what, or it might not be. But if it's all part of your shtick, a person wearing a suit can, if it's congruent, like with their kind of overall way of coming across their storyline, then that's great. What you don't want to do is have contradictions in your own storyline. You don't want to be like, we pride ourselves on our professionalism and then show up 5 minutes late and be dressed casually. On the other hand, you could theoretically look like totally golf, but your shtick is that, look, I'm like a computer hacker rebel dude, and this is what we look like. And believe me, I can rank you better than those people that they look like they're like business people, but they don't know jack about the internet. And either of those can work. My point is that what you want is a storyline that works, right? So these layers of the onion have different traits. Sometimes they're okay as long as other layers are congruent with dress, right? Just like with OMG and our niche, I can dress and look casual. And as a matter of fact, having the whole thing, the website, everything look casual goes along interestingly well with with one type of storyline that can work well in the niche of making money because of like the idea that we're normal people like you, which is true. It's not like a false storyline. And we don't even look particularly sharp, right? but we're cool and quirky. We have our own custom artwork, right? We do things our own way and it looks that way and it's effective. And look, we made a bunch of money, right? That works well. Right? As I mentioned before, if I was a lawyer, maybe all successful lawyers, people wanted someone that's going to win a case and they all look like someone who has gold plated Picasso's hanging in there next to a rubber plant in a penthouse office, right? Oh, thank you, Susanna. Glad you liked the webinar. And so getting back to this, so not all filters, not all layers of the onion are absolute. Some, they have different traits, and understanding different ways that filters, layers of the onion and so forth can be in and of itself is a filter about filters, which is great, right? That's a meta mindset is the first thing you do is look to get meta about meta, right? So the more we understand different ways that layers of the onion can be, the better. So there, and then there's some that are full category changers or full blocks or full wins, right? I wrote an ebook early on in OMG, or it had a bunch of videos that are amazing by Greg showing how he ranked a website, like literally every moment he was doing it, he put it on video in 2012. But I wrote a lot of the words talking about strategy and SEO, like not teaching SEO, but meta strategy, as if it was about like online business and stuff, but really it was meta strategy of my type applied to business. But I made a number of arguments in there, such as that you want to go for $3 million, where if anyone buys just one of those arguments, then they're generally going to want to buy OMG. And there might be another important reason why they don't buy, but at the point where they want to buy, then that's pretty major, right? So sometimes you can like totally win based on one thing, right? Such as if a client was convinced for sure that he's losing a bunch of money by not being on the top of Google, and then he wants that money, or he or she wants that money, and they're losing it, and the ROI is clear. If you happen to win that argument, then you're probably going to make the sale no matter what else is going on. You can maybe be like, oh my gosh, but $4,000 is so much. Are you sure you want it? Like, yeah, I want it. So no matter, maybe a battle of absolute there. I said, but they can absolutely take you out. So they can absolutely make the sale. But you also have to watch it with these big absolutes where you win in one shot. People often take themselves out trying to go for those things, right? That's ignoring the semi-soft lock concept where it's often too difficult to reach those things, right? So making the ROI argument may or may not be what you want to do. Instead, you might want to use the argument, look, if part of your overall ad spend, that's why a number of people that are successful with client consulting in terms of money, they'll say, look for businesses that are spending whatever amount, $10,000 or more on advertising in general, and say, look, why don't we try spending a tenth of that on SEO? Isn't that what you say? That's a much easier semi-soft lock to hit, right? It's a lot easier to win that, to make that argument in a way that someone buys it, right? Isn't this worth 10% of your ad spend? Is a pretty good argument for SEO, right? A lot of business owners, I can easily imagine myself agreeing with that. Whereas trying to prove that there's an ROI is harder. You win if you do it, and people can do it too, right? And you can try to make both arguments, and whichever one sticks, depending. But you don't want to trip over them. You don't want them to trip over themselves, and you don't want to make a weak link argument that steals the show from one that's going to work for you. But it might be that if you make isn't it worth doing 10% of your ad spend, and then at that point, that's a semi-soft lock. You have that if you're competent past that, where you don't have a problem asking for the money, where you appear competent, like I talked about before, right? You make them feel like you're like there's a bunch of people that are incompetent out there, and you're not one of those. You're competent, but you win that argument. You don't just make it. Right? You somehow trigger it in their mind, right? Whatever's going to trigger it, whatever category is it, such trigger it. Then that may well be the way to go. And then you tailor your kind of shtick about your own identity to what kind of works for you, right? My kind of casual millionaire thing works for me because I want to dress this, right? Like for me, I wear clothes to not make them issue, right? I'm not trying to win the game with my clothes. I'm just trying to not be taken out. And then I win other ways, right? For other people, they really try to get a good advantage out of their clothes because that's where their inclination is. And that's totally valid, like I said, but it's not really where I'm at naturally. And so I just have a storyline that goes along with that. That's correct. That's reasonable. And this is certainly one way that a multimillionaire looks, is they look like they can dress how they want. But then I don't dress in a way that just looks like I'm a slob, right? Because then that creates a potential issue that's not helpful. Fairly obvious, but just illustrate. Let's stay specifically though with, yeah, the 10% of your, yeah, 10% of your ad spend, somebody soft blocking, exactly. And I don't want to take credit for that. I think that's been mentioned, but it's great to have that reinforced. It's good for me to pick out certain particularly good strategies that our coaches have said because they've said a lot. John says your clothing can make a difference if the client has an expectation. Exactly. And what did I say about triggers? Right? If they have a trigger, then great. It's sometimes possible to, if you look different, to have a quick storyline that goes along with it, but it sometimes isn't possible. And you just have to find that out. You're poking around. You can see if it's a bottleneck. That's how you poke. What's a bottleneck and what is it? But yeah, I'd probably go for like a clean look. It's not a full suit, but it's something like a, what do you think, John? Is it like a good clean look with a button down shirt and pants, but not like a full Armani suit? Oh, very cool. You're welcome, Bryce. John's probably responding. But so let's also think specifically about this asking for the money thing. In a corporate setting, a tie makes you over the top these days. Right. I tend to agree. Plus taking a button down shirt, no tie and pants, and it all looking fairly put together, probably ironed within reason and so forth. I would probably try to avoid that if it was me, but if I needed to, I assume. Oh, sorry. I'm not saying you should ignore it. You shouldn't. You should go for that. I'm just saying that me being me probably would, but I don't recommend you trying to. Pants are essential in most business settings. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I'd wear pants. Okay. Exactly. Yeah, I would say button down shirt, no tie and pants, and have it all look reasonably like you put some reasonable care into your clothes. Hello, good people. All right, so let's look specifically at this thing about asking for the money and how that relates. And oh, and also this will illustrate how we can adjust our filters. Right, I want to work with this with you right now. So one thing you might be doing is, let's see, we have filters triggered from what's already in our mind, but we can adjust what's getting triggered. So if you're thinking about asking for the money and how that's hard, then you might be thinking of the wrong sort of analogy or category for yourself. In other words, like about asking for the money. So you might be thinking about times when people ask you for money and you don't like it. Oh, you're very welcome, Dan. So you're, in other words, representing making a sale to a client in the wrong way. It's possible you're talking to the wrong audience, but the audience tends to go along with your filter. The girls that I talk to tended to get selected by my worldview in addition to how I acted toward them. Does that make sense? So the people you're talking to and how you act and then how they respond, it's all going to, the bit get set by this filter and you'll naturally talk to different people. Mike, you remember what I said? Look, we're ending up with a lot of like working with people and doing these joint ventures where they're backstabby, crappy people. And I think that we need to look at the world differently ourselves, do things like take ourselves to a higher level in order to attract people to a higher level. And attraction is really a sort of filter. It has to be that one. Even with a magnet, bit of theory, but a little bit too much of a tangent right now. But you can imagine as being like a series of filters for if it randomly goes one way or another way. If that local peak robot, the robot that's set with the algorithm, where you set it on like a mountain range and then it's on a particular peak and the algorithm is take a step. If you go higher, then keep going in that direction. If your step takes you lower, then turn randomly and that algorithm will get him to the top. If you set that algorithm, if you think about it, that can look like there's a magnet pulling on the robot. If there were a magnet like pulling on the robot, it would look the same. Especially if you smoothed it out in like hyper time, it would look like there was a magnet pulling the robot up, right? Because the robot would take a step. If it went down, it would spin. If it went down again, it would spin a bit, and then it would be in a way facing relatively up, and it would just keep walking until it got to the top. So it looked like a magnet. So it shows how magnets don't actually need to, but there's no magnet pulling it, right? The result of the algorithm running, along with randomness, looks like a magnet operating. So, and that's how the law of attraction actually works. And so I said to Mike, I want to attract a different caliber of people. And so we need to be different ourselves, one way or the other. And it wasn't that we were backstabbing people or not, but there's a way that we had to take something up a notch with things. And we did. It's a little hard for me to explain it right now, but I focused on that and we did it. And then we ended up with incredibly high quality partners, radically different than who we worked with before. And part of that is saying no. to both products, questionable businesses in general, right? Kind of things. And we did that. Like we had to be people that would say no to kind of things that would be questionable. Like even the idea with coaching being something like that you hire coaches and they just teach out of a curriculum. If we were going to be someone that did that, then we would attract people that would do the same thing, which is people that weren't really caring much about the welfare of others in a certain way. And you don't need, in business, you're still doing business, but there's a certain level of integrity that you want in the people you're working with. But if we didn't have that level, then there was a way that naturally we were going to not have the effect that looks like a magnet on the right people. And I did that intentionally along with Mike, and it worked just as predicted. But it was quite intentional, and it worked very well, and it looked like the magnet, like the law of attraction. Okay, so let's continue to let this guide us to picture thing where you're imagining asking for the money and you're associating it with a telemarketer, or you're helping out a friend. Oh, or even what I harped on last time about you're doing good for people. You're focused on, like when people are focused on this kind of like a real value, then the trouble with that is it also leads to when you genuinely are doing something good for people, culturally and even really, what are we generally taught about that? Like when you do good for people, if you work at a soup kitchen, do you believe you should demand money for that? A friend, if you knew how to do CPR and your friend was drowning, do you expect money for doing CPR on them or life-saving, advanced life-saving on them if they're drowning or they swallowed water? Or if your friend needs help and you help them? So there's a way that you're accidentally categorizing to some or to a greater or lesser degree your business as something that's in another category that triggers for you where you don't accept money for that sort of thing. When I talked about, look, if you're like that, you might want to treat it like you're alcoholic, and really I went on the other end of it. But there's a way that I'm realizing now that it goes along logically with accepting money. When you realize that making money for yourself, your business, is about what other people value and are willing to pay for, then it is so much easier to ask for the money, right? Because if you say, look, I'm doing this for the money. I'm going to find something, and because of that, I'm going to find something other people want to pay for that they value. And I'm going to do that. It's not my first choice, right? So once you stop thinking, oh, I want to do this anyway, it's my passion, blah, 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 then if you happen to hit the jackpot and get it all without effort, right? This is the problem is people will get basically lucky, like sometimes, and they'll profit from their passion and then they'll preach it as if that applies to everyone. And I preach against it because I'm trying to make sure everyone can succeed, right? Anyone can cite positive examples of that working, profiting from your passion working, and they can make an argument for why it's effective. Hey, look, you're more passionate, you like what you're doing, so that's a benefit. And I agree that's a benefit. But the trouble is it comes automatically with attendant drawback. Like being in a bad relationship with someone that has pluses, but the minuses are bigger. And there's really not necessarily for some of us, including myself, not for all of us, but for some of us, we have problems if we think of it that way, right? Once it's your passion, there's two problems. One is other people might not want to pay for it, or they might not want to pay nearly as much for it as something else. They'll pay a heck of a lot more. And if your goals are that heck of a lot more money, you're not going to get there. You're on a local peak that's not high enough. It's the kind of thing you like, even if they pay you. And it might not scale very well. The other problem is if it causes you to have much more difficulty asking for the money. And it's a known problem that many people face, like stage fright. Different, but it's common, right? Like fear of public speaking. A lot of people fear or have, anyway, they have an issue with asking for money. But I think about context and I naturally, a lot of times I don't even realize how much I'm setting, like how much context I'm putting in or things that aren't like obvious. But the reason I harp so much on quit worrying about what you think is valuable. And you might think, David, if I think it's valuable, then I be able to charge money for it better? Yeah, if you think it's valuable to them. And I agree with that. You want to buy your own product. But if you think it should be valuable, if you think it's really valuable, if you think the value is inherent within the action that you're doing, then you're satisfied. There's already value. Why would they need to pay money? The world is made better just by you doing your service for free. Like that's the logical step. Like that flows logically from the belief that you're doing good by just providing your passion itself. Believe it or not, this is I don't remember if I said this to you guys or not. Like I probably did, but I actually don't think it helps people that much to help them earn money. People tend to stay in the same spot that they're at. They earn more money or be worse. Now, overall, if I'm able to help people enough with meta stuff along with making money, then that's helpful. But InsurTech is a good way to make money is if you could successfully show people how to make money in a way that also makes sense to them. And it's not even enough to show people how to actually make money. That's not nearly as valuable as something that looks like to people like it makes sense for them to make money. And plus, if they're not ashamed to tell their friends or their spouse about it. Those are the big things people look for in like a make money program, right? Like implicitly as well. What if I tell my wife or husband that I bought it? Are they going to kill me or is this going to make sense to them, right? That's why stuff like some Amazon programs fly off the shit is much easier to sell. Not necessarily $8,000, but if it's like just like a pure e-commerce or even e-commerce, it's easier to explain to your spouse. Right? That's what people want. So anyway, so I do this niche in essence because other people want it. Like Mike wanted it and the prospect wanted to buy it. Like people wanted to pay a lot of money for it compared to other topics that I might teach about. And back when, this is years ago, right, that I got into this. And I'm going to move along where this OMG can continue, but without me really being so focused on it and so forth over time. But specifically, in addition to a number of meta strategies I'm showing you, I want to specifically help you in this webinar. So there's the overall idea of seeing thing as made up of layers, right? As I've talked about, and we haven't completed that job, but we started with it today. And then the other is the specific thing about being able to ask for the money. And as another illustration of how people go for the glory hound or the storming the gates or the thing in the center or the thing rather than context, when people think about trying to ask for the money, they try to think about how do I get better at asking for the money as if they need a better script or how do you present yourself to do it? How do I say it? But instead you need to figure out what in the context, what's the filter, the layer, whatever, that's making it feel hard. And that's what we're hitting, right? So we're getting outside of this problem so it won't crop up rather than trying to give you tactics to deal with it after it happens, right? We're trying to get rid of and if I had a tactic, I would give it to you too. I believe in treating both the symptom and the cause, right? But we mainly can get rid of you're already given plenty of tactics already in OMG. And when I have them, I give them to you as well. But let's also just get rid of the swamp, right? Let's get rid of the problematic filter that's causing a problem here. Asking for 20K to help generate 50K. Yeah, but it's so much easier, ironically, to say, look, you're already spending 10K. How about we take 1K of that or 2K of that and put it towards SEO because the potential ROI is huge. When it comes to SEO, it's a little, in this way, it's like information marketing. What's the upside of OMG? Like 50, 100,000, obviously even more than this for some people, but at least, and let's just be really conservative and say $20,000 a month is like a super realistic upside for OMG. 20,000 a month, that's about close to 250 a year, right? 240 a year. The upside of that, so that's 250. I don't say let's just pay half of that for OMG. So OMG is not $120,000 every year for us. Instead, it's 8,000, right? And then 2,000 for the next year. Same thing with SEO. I mean, it's going to take months to rank. They're not guaranteed that people will convert exactly. It's super beneficial. There's all kinds of story after story. It works totally for clients. But you're not going to I wouldn't necessarily go for a ratio of 1/4 of their potential ROI for spending upfront for several months on poking, right? Instead, it's more like a small, like 5% or whatever it might be. When Khan's charging a lawyer 5,000, the lawyer can pull in 100,000 easy, right, in a month. What's that? From the business. And so that's 120, right? 5%. So something a little bit more in that range, I would guess. Again, I would defer, certainly if Fletch or Joe or Cotton or Stephen were to, getting anyone important there, because Greg doesn't like do a ton of client work, like local client work. And Liz is Amazon, and Mike and myself don't. But if one of them were to tell me a different ratio, were to tell you a different ratio, absolutely go with them. But somewhere in that range is probably about 120 of the potential. or about 10%, 10 to 20% of their ad spend, maybe 15% of their ad spend, whatever. But let's make sure you might have gotten this point, but it's pretty profound, right? To see how with this asking for the money, when you do what I suggested and harped on last time, which is to focus on the value to them and not your idea. You have to understand that not your idea of the value to them. So careful of that, Joseph. You're still a little bit, I think, possibly in your own head. Like I would trade 20K for, I would trade 20K for 40K, but I wouldn't trade 20K and a bunch of effort necessarily for 40K. I wouldn't trade 20K and something that might not work plus a bunch of effort for 40K, right? I wouldn't necessarily trade 2K for a bunch of effort and risk. So you need to look at what are the bottlenecks for them and what's the value as they see it, right? You see what I mean? So you really need to get where they're at and lead them from there. And so this value to them, it's really easy to twist it back into the previous idea that's wrong that people have in their heads of value in general, as if it's real. In the same way that there's no core of an onion. Once again, our meta strategies will add up for us. We got to stop with this idea of things existing in their own right and start to see that they're made up of a bunch of layers. And like you add up the lenses and filters of context and there's nothing left. It's all made up of that. When you see a couch, there's not a couch that triggers a couch in your brain. There's a set of contextual things that trigger a couch in your brain. If you remove all the context, there's no couch anymore because what you think of as the couch itself is still context. Great time to run hard with client getting the media at large. We'll be helping our cause with online advertising. Fully expect to surpass advertising next 6 months. Nice, yeah. Business people who understand ROI, John writes, that's return on investment, of course, have a preconceived idea what the correct threshold in the context of their business market. Discover what that is. Exactly. So John coming from the right place, which we would expect from John, who's successful with client consulting. He's shown us a house he's bought with OMG money, so to speak, and so forth. Discover what that is and craft a way to meet it. Much easier than convincing them it should be otherwise. Everything, as you understand more and more that everything people see is triggered from what's already in their minds, literally, it has to already be in their minds. It's just a matter of what gets triggered. And the triggering is a set of filters and lenses and categories and context. It's not one thing. And just understanding more about that process and how it works will transform your ability to control your own mind. I say control because you control your own mind. Your mind itself disappears like an onion. It's a layers of triggers and context and beliefs, right? And so forth. Some are blocks, some influence. There are hodgepodges and archetypes. And as you understand what what the onion is made of, then there's no thing to move, right? The causes of things don't involve moving stuff. Yeah, that works as a representation in the physical world, but it's not very transitive. Interestingly enough, like moving stuff around like chess pieces, once you try to do that with your own mind or with people, it doesn't work very well at all. When you understand instead that a person's mind is composed of a bunch of vectors or filters, like there's all kinds of different ways that help to represent it. And having multiple ways to represent it helps you from getting locked into the blindness that comes from only representing it one way. And that's how you control a mind, is by affecting vectors. And how do you choose what vectors? Look for the ones that are easiest for you to adjust. And the ones you're trying to get the most bang per buck. The ones that you can adjust in, for example, if you're making a sale, what are things that you can realistically affect? What are your tools you have to work with? You can show them something. You can say words to them, right? What frames can be triggered in their mind, right? But the idea that business people like to take risks, that's not necessarily true. As I pointed out, it can depend on the nature of their romantic relationship. It can be related to what their own personality, of course, coming into it. There's layer upon layer. You need to get a sense of where someone's mind is at. A startup can be okay for you. That's how Jamie Washington, who we saw her start from scratch last year and take things to an incredible level. Seems like in the 6 figures a month, even while dealing with being treated by cancer. And I remember her saying early on, right when she was starting, some of her early clients were startups, and Cotton had on his website that he doesn't work with startups. And they're both right. just like two different ways of dressing. And to get started, almost anything's right. And that was what was coming to her at first. And then she started killing it. But it works great for cotton. Cotton doesn't meet with clients in person. Does that make it right or wrong? No. It's actually generally a drawback. But you can make it work for yourself. Just if you have a nose ring and you look all goth, you could literally make that work for yourself. If you didn't want to try to hide that entire look, it might be hard to hide that underneath a button-down shirt and pants. Instead, you can do the whole shtick of being like a hacker type, right? Like literally the movie Hackers. If you look like one of those guys, then that can trigger that for someone to see the movie. As one of Angelina Jolie's first movies. You work with what works for you. Cotton, it works for Cotton because it makes him look like he's too successful to meet with people, right? But that he has the personality to go with it, right? You see what I mean? Some things, whether they're helpful or not, is dependent on other layers, other content. Like dress is an example. Is a good my way of illustrating that. Not everything though. Some things are just going to pretty much be a disadvantage with everyone, right? And if you can't ask for the money, if you can't have this concept of what other people value, monetarily value, someone can theoretically value something, but they're not going to pay for it, right? My own teaching is an example of that, right? Probably how much people value it after the fact is not very connected to what people pay for it before the fact, right? Or maybe pay for it ever, right? But people value it another way tremendously. So it's one of those things that's quirky when it comes to money. So when you're trying to make money, you want something that's not so quirky, right? Where people can measure it better. And weirdly enough, measuring, it might look like apples to talk about money people could potentially make on return on investment. But if it were me personally, I'd probably try a whole pitch that ignored return on investment completely and didn't really talk about it. Cotton talked about something that's different, which is how much money they're losing. He talked about effect. He talked about, okay, you're a roofer. Here's how much traffic is coming through this keyword according to Google's keyword plan, or whatever they're using right now, whatever keyword tool you're using. Here's how much traffic is coming through. Let's suppose that this amount of people actually buys the roof and it's something reasonable, right? 8%, 20%. This percent goes to the buy, like, so that much, this is how much a roofing gig averages, $8,000, right? And so that's how much money is flowing through Google right now. Do you want some of it? That's not ROI exactly. That's just how much money is going to your competitors. Do you want some of it? That's different. You're just stating facts. They come to the wrong conclusion. Once you start talking about return on investment, you're probably going, think about a girl is thinking of hopping into bed with you when you're dating, or think about something similar to that if that doesn't work for you, specifically with the genders and everything. But do you really want to talk about ROI on that? Like even metaphorically speaking, do you want to stop and say, do you think this is going to be a good idea, like socially and in terms of your self-respect and everything? I don't mean it won't be. It might be, also depending on how awesome you are, right? But do you really want her stopping and thinking about that when she's getting excited and kissing you? No. So does that mean that's exactly metaphorical to the sale? Maybe not, but I represented it and I triggered something for you and I created a filter for you to see it in that way. Is that the only way to represent it? Maybe not, but it might have been very helpful. Right? And I say that, what I just said to the last sentence or two, to just give you more meta about filters and so on. But I gave you a way to represent it. You can picture it like that. Do you want to talk about ROI? Or would you do that if you're trying to get a girl into bed? Would you talk about the analogy to ROI when it comes to dating? Is this going to be a good overall long-term payoff for you socially or with your own self-image? With some people that might be helpful, but overall that's probably going to put the brakes on things, right? Maybe depending on who you are. But even if you're like the lead singer for a rock, maybe still the answer might be no. But it's just generally the question that you might not want them asking. So that's yet another example of a layer of an onion that you may or may not spot. And I may or may not have spotted until I started thinking along those lines. But when you start thinking about the layers, then you start to compile these things. And once you compile something transitive or even a specific type of layer to look for, now you have a filter for that's part of your toolbox, right? So again, maybe ROI is not a good thing to bring up. Yes, that is gold, Julie. I'm glad you noticed that. And it's only a matter of not having too many threads open at once. I didn't really get into it, and I'll look to get into it big time at some point soon. It's a fascinating thing. It's totally different than how people think by default. Oh, let me mention this about default. So the way that things are by default. So for example, when I talked about a guy and his views on the general attitudes of women about various things are maybe shaped in the background by how his mother was when he was young, or at least how he perceived it. That's a default context. Is it always there? Yes. Does our mind see contrast? Yes. It sees with that layer of the onion, right? That contextual element of how his mother was or how he perceived, right? How his mother was. But it's always there. If something is always there, do you see it? Oh, great. Joseph, that house saying, I get it. Awesome. So do you see something that is always there? No, it fades away. As I mentioned, literally physically, if they numb your muscle in your eye so it stops doing saccades, these micro movements you're not even aware of, your vision or what will actually fade away. Or if they manage to track them, but if you're looking at a screen with just a circle and they manage to have it exactly match the motion of your eyes, they both disappear. Kind of like standing on the earth. The earth is moving, but you're both moving, so you don't notice it. Anyway, it's in the background, this idea. And so do we see it? No. So there's all these filters. That's why this stuff about childhood stuff, right? So much of psychology is what? Discovering that background matters more than we think, right? Why do people feel like it doesn't matter? Because they don't see it. Now, why does the nature of how we see matter so much? Is because you see, we can't just, this is true of default in general. And this is a big point here. By default, people don't see default, therefore they think the default doesn't matter. So by default, people think that their impression of their mother when they were 3 doesn't matter when they're dating, right? They don't think about it, therefore they don't think it matters. I don't mean if you were to interview someone or give them a yes or no question, do you think it matters? If you were to bring it to someone's mind and ask them whether they think it matters, then probably people would still think that it matters less than it does, but they would probably, a fair amount would say yes, relative to if you don't even bring up the question. So just if you look at how people act, just like when you're doing sales with potential clients, your attitude about accepting money and your kind of filter for that and how you represent it, how your mind represents it, you don't realize that matters, right? Because you just don't see it at all. And so it doesn't seem to matter because it's invisible. Everything that's invisible basically doesn't seem like by nature doesn't seem to matter. So default matters tremendously because it's part of the context, right? Whatever the default is, right? Whatever things are going on in the background that are influencing stuff, right? That's automatically happening. Like the currents when you're sailing a ship. That's part of the default, right? And they matter. The currents are more visible because they're not always there and they change. So therefore people know about currents. But if it was fully invisible, then people wouldn't realize it matters, but it's still effective. So default is something I think about constantly. And I'm talking about the topic, the word in abstract, but trouble is everything's an example of it. So when I try to think of a specific example, oh, like when I talked about the story about Mike and myself attracting a higher caliber of people with higher integrity, then we needed to act with more integrity ourselves in ways that weren't obvious. We weren't running around stealing from people, but there was still a level of integrity that we could go higher with, and we did, right? Um, just integrity, certain type of professionalism, and so forth. Literally, this wasn't not Mike, but as another person we were working with. We showed up. It would just be obvious that some people we were working with years ago, but like a team of ours, were just like smoking pot consistently, including like while they were out kind of meeting with people that we were doing a joint venture with in a way that it was just in their face. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't smoke pot, but there's a way that like if you show up for a client meeting and you've been smoking pot, then that shows a level of a lack of whatever the heck you want to call it. Professionalism doesn't even seem like quite the right word for that, but just a lack of like basic integrity in it, right? Because you're just being disrespectful to the project. There you go. So there's like a level of incompetence and not being an A player that demonstrates. And the people who did it, well, they were like, well, we should be able to do what we want. Like we don't work for them. But again, and that made sense to them. But it's nonsense in the sense of you're not going to work with A players that way because A players want you to perform at a certain level on the test. It's not about pot being good or bad. It's just not something that you're going to be like if you're working on internet marketing launch, then if you're high constantly, It's just not going to help you be an A player, according to many A players. Now, some do think that, and it'll work well. And there's a whole niche in internet marketing. You can go to plenty of events and you get in the special room of networking with a whole bunch of other people who are smoking. But I've worked with those people and they lack integrity. And a lot of them are big names, but I've worked with them and they lack integrity and they backstab the heck out of you. And it's crap. You see what I mean? So it can seem like it even helps with networking, but what it ends up doing is and I'm saying this also, a lot of you aren't dealing with this exact issue exactly, but it's close to what you're doing. But it illustrates, again, a meta concept. If I ever seem to be off topic, I'm illustrating a meta concept. But we can't stress enough that I intentionally made sure we stepped it up in a different way. And it totally worked. And it was clearly traceable just to that. Okay, so I'm talking talk myself out of my layers, triggers, the sale. Oh, noticing different things. Oh, and I was telling you something's important, which is about default. I was talking about default. Got it. Oh, and Mike said it's incredibly true. So I get corroboration. So I'm talking about default. So there are these things, and I'm talking about what's invisible because it's always there and we see different, right? Again, our mind makes representations. It makes the seemingly things out of difference, and then things that are always there fade into the background. We don't notice them. And what happens is, here's the thing. So our mind makes things out of difference. And our mind attributes causal power, causes to things. And therefore, since default is invisible, it's not turned into a thing. And so our mind doesn't come up with it as the cause. What our mind does with causality, which it's like a representational shortcut that either works or sometimes fails miserably. And it's fundamentally false. A representation is fundamentally, an ambassador to a country is not the country, right? They represent the country, but they're nothing like the country. And there's all sorts of ways where having the ambassador represent the country and then there's all sorts of ways where it's beyond ridiculous to think that the ambassador is the country, right? So again, it makes sense within a context where it makes sense, and then it totally doesn't work outside of that. The way that our mind thinks that reasons work, and I've talked about this in all kinds of different ways, including my famous, so to speak, computer analogy of the pixels causing the base of the ball to be hit, right? That's not how it works. But our mind acts as if things cause events and stuff. So it fabricates things out of all the layers of the onion. If you peel away all the context, there's no thing there anymore. But our mind acts as if there is. And that works until it doesn't work. But we need to be able to think outside of it, or else we're trapped in a fundamental local peak in life that basically everyone's trapped in, that if I help you out, or if there's some other person helping that I'm not aware, or if you figure it out yourself. But this gets to what my basic contribution to you and why I said last time you have me now. And that's an additional factor where you're going to succeed. Because this is a game changer. So there's default currents, vectors, like the way that a guy feels about how women are in general, but not aware of it. He doesn't think this way overtly, like it's a choice, right? It doesn't make him a good or a bad man or a person or a bigot or a chauvinist or a good guy or whatever. Inherently, it's just the default thing he's not aware. Defined that way, fine. But you know what I'm saying? This isn't the guy's good or bad. There's no value judgment here, right? But it colors how he sees women and what he, like, even if a woman is throwing himself at him, if he doesn't see that's how it works, he won't see it, right? He won't create a space for it. Or if a woman would be loyal, people can even do what seems like sabotage, right? We go, why do I keep sabotage, right? So there's the default that's invisible, but it's just as much a cause as the stuff that is visible. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the exact situation. But what is visible is actually never the actual cause, but stuff really closely related to what's visible might be the cause, like close enough to the cause. But so there are these currents, there are these layers and filters and so forth that are always there, and therefore they're invisible. And that's the default setting, right? That's what's going on invisibly by default in the background. And depending on the situation and stuff, it can be very powerful. It can be 99% of a result you get sometimes, or it can be 10% or it can be 50%, whatever, depending on where you stop peeling away layers of the onion, right? Again, it's always 100% layers the onion. There's no thing inside the onion, right? You keep peeling, it's all gone. But some stuff is there and not there, and so our mind sees the contrast. What I mean is some things are there, sometimes they're not there, right? If you're doing a project, you take on a new partner, they do some things that are new, and you succeed where you didn't before, it might clearly look like that's what caused it. And you might be right. That was the main thing. However, first of all, the success was actually probably based on a whole bunch of other layers that were there in the first place. Plus, you needed that additional element. You added that element, and it looks like that's almost the full cause, first of all. But I'm also showing how that new element might have been part of the reason, right? The new person doing the new strategy, the new skill they added, the new perspective, whatever. But your mind will see that because it's different. It can see it not being there and it can see it being there, right? And therefore it can make a thing out of it. But default stuff fades away to be invisible, and yet it's massive. And people don't know to look for it. The word default is typically not even in people's vocabulary at all. Therefore, they don't even more don't see it, except people use the physical, like the word default, but in the specific meaning that's relevant to meta strategy when I'm talking. They'll talk about the default settings of a computer program, right? Or their phone, but not how the default settings of our perspectives and even the default settings of a person's personality. People get so caught up in their behavior, the results, right? I poke around to try to get a sense of where the person is by default. And really, it leads me to very different conclusions. In practice, you might theorize that wouldn't their behavior show their default? No, there's all kinds of reasons why it wouldn't. They could be having a bad day. They could have a factor that's causing them to have a bad year. There could be a member of the team or a way that they got started with things that got in there and keeps tainting things, that's messing them up. Or there could be a reason why they look way better. They could be spending a whole year trying to impress me because they want to be a part of OMG, right? So you can look at their behavior for a year and still not spot what their default, such like kind of personality or things are, right? But if you're looking for default and you get used to the meta of how to look for default, once you start looking and once you're used to meta, then you learn, like, again, if I tell you to look for default, don't conclude, okay, I'll just look for default. How do you go about doing anything is you understand it, right? You peel away the layers of how default works itself. You don't just decide you're a master at it tomorrow because I told you, right? You'll build it up. But learning to understand, to see, you can see default when you understand how you see, which is you see difference. And the default might always be there, except in your mind, you can imagine it not being there. If you're in a marriage, you're always married to your wife. And so what happens is people forget about what it's like to not be married to the wife. Or let's talk about being an entrepreneur. If you're always if you're an entrepreneur for a bunch of years and you don't have a job, you might forget about how even hard it might be to get a job. I keep in mind that if I were to look for a job, I might find not one job at all. And I don't take for granted. I don't know how I would earn $50,000 a year. I don't know how I would earn $20,000 a year. I don't know if I could. Even working at Starbucks, I don't know if I could handle it. They stand for hours, right? Like if I were hiring someone, I wouldn't necessarily want to hire me. And I don't know, just things like that. Maybe we could make some argument that I could do the job. But also if someone had been unemployed for a while, even if I could theoretically be good at a job, maybe they would fear I wouldn't be motivated to do it, which they might be. You know what I mean? That can be invisible, but it won't, but just by thinking about it not being there properly, then you make it visible. So you can take things that were otherwise invisible and make them visible. Now, sometimes you don't even know what to look for. A lot of your default stuff is so invisible, you don't even know how to go out looking to see it because you don't see it. So how do you do that? And that's why I look for, with an attitude of meta, you can see default from the outside. Sometimes you can see it's such a deep meta strategy, it'll start to reveal a whole bunch of things you wouldn't see otherwise, right? So one of the reasons why I talk about government sometimes is sometimes these things show up in other areas, or evolution that I talked about today and other times. Sometimes you only spot what you otherwise wouldn't spot. If there's a parallel anomaly somewhere else, you use that to see something deep. And then that new thing that you figure out allows you to see something different about making money or making a sale or ranking a website or whatever, or goal revealing or goal setting. that you wouldn't have otherwise spotted. I've spotted so much by having a meta seeking mindset while playing strategy games, right? Plenty of other people play games and get nothing out of it. When I play games, I like it inherently because it's a hobby, and the hobbies have their own great benefit and a whole number of ripple effects in your life. It's great and important to have a hobby, and people don't know that overall. They might stumble into it, but they don't realize that a pretty much critical part of your success in life and happiness is to have a hobby and to go with it. Otherwise, you start to try to make a hobby out of things that shouldn't be hobbies, and you get all manic and obsessed in ways that are purely unhelpful. Shows up with drama and stuff. You start complaining to your wife, she doesn't spend enough time with you. Then you have your hobby and everything's fine. That's not tongue in cheek, really. I can make jokes out of that. There's a way to look at that in a funny way, but there's also a way to look at it in a serious minded way that's very true. And then vice versa. What was I saying? Look, I've been talking about hobbies. Games are hobbies have their own benefits, but I've gotten so much out of figuring out goals because when you're playing a role playing game or a strategy game, there's so much in there where you're going after achieving goals or not, or you're leveling up and enjoying just gaining levels inherently, but then you reach the top and then something happens. You're like, like I got to where I was, and then there's different motivation and so forth. And you can see how you just like, and there's all kinds of ways where things can seem like they're really beneficial, like running around and fighting stuff and defeating it in a way that's really not actually taking you forward, even in the game. Like you feel like you're making progress, but you're just running in circles. You don't realize it doesn't look like running. Like you're gaining more of a resource like gold, but that gold itself is not a limiting thing, and you don't realize it. Or maybe gold was limiting early on when you're low level, and it's not a limiting factor later. It's not a bottleneck, but you mistakenly think it is because you're not thinking about it properly, and you don't know to look for that. And you just keep on doing stuff to get gold, but you're not increasing in ways that are really going to be a bottleneck later. Does that matter outside of a game? Not the details, but the meta of that is totally relevant outside of a game. And so I've spotted thing after thing in games. I've spotted it all kinds of times with relationships, as I pointed out. That's how I spot stuff. But I also spot it. It changed my life when I went to college and I saw how the professors believed in evolution, including I would ask them about anomalies and their answers were, I'll say the following thing. I don't think it's inherently offensive. I think I even mentioned it briefly before. I asked Jewish people, I knew a lot of them growing up, they both in college and before in school, why they didn't believe in Jesus, not condescendingly, but just out of curiosity. Right? Obviously someone could be Jewish and also believe in Jesus, but basically to be Jewish means you don't believe that Jesus is God. And so I would ask them why, out of curiosity, not there was something wrong with that, just curiosity, what they're thinking. And not one of them had a reply that had anything coherent. And I even sometimes would read books, and even the scholars had nothing that made any sense. It was literally, I think I mentioned at some point, but literally even in scholarly books, they give the same exact thing that they thought 2,000 years ago, like the disciples stole the body or something, which is an extraordinary. If that's your best explanation of why you don't believe in Jesus, then maybe there's an explanation of why he appeared to be resurrected to so many people, but that's not it. And the traditional hand-waving theories about it, how he appeared to be resurrected to so many people, and how a whole movement started after he died based on the fact that he did resurrect. If you think it's easy to convince people that you resurrected, try it. I bet you can't do it. And no one's done it, right? I don't think there's any other movement called religion based on a person actually resurrecting themselves and then walking around talking to people after they did and telling people they were going to do it and then doing it and then having an actual whole massive following based on that fact. If you think about it, I don't know that anyone's accomplished. And then the same exact person has stories about them performing miracles. The same exact person fulfilled bazillion specific prophecies, relatively specific prophecies. So that's quite a trick. And that at least demands some, and plus the stuff that he said is astounding. So when you put it all together, and what I found is no one has any response that has any substance to it that I've seen. They're all just totally ignore. The response is to have no thought about it whatsoever. Like every single person that doesn't believe in Jesus as God, they just don't consider it. The same reason why they might not believe that Buddha was anything particular, or something like that. But they're two different circumstances. There's really no comparison between the claims about Buddha themselves. I don't mean not even comparing Buddha and Jesus, but they're just fundamentally different, right? So there may be some explanation, but in my experience reading and talking to people, there was. And I never happen to have met a Jewish person with any explanation. Generally, they would say, well, I'm Jewish. Of course, I don't believe in Jesus. So that would be the reason for not believing in Jesus was an identity, like a category. And also, as I said, with professors, they believe in evolution, but evolution, no step of evolution makes any sense. I'll give an example about sales here, but no, not only did every step of the way in evolutionary theory, science, archaeology, and theory all go against it, but anytime you ask an actual evolutionist, and I've done this, I was in college and my major was essentially these courses. It's not that they had a bad response. They basically had no response ever. Like they didn't try. It's bizarre. Like it'll almost sound like I must be missing something. I must be crazy saying this, but I did. I watched it. I still watch it. They don't say it. And there's books explaining evolution, how it works, but the real life people didn't have that explanation. There are books that argue for it, but if you just know the counter arguments, they don't like it's not even close. And they make points that are nonsense. And like I said, like they genuinely believe things. If a monkey types at a typewriter long enough, or if you have a monkey typing in the typewriter randomly, they'll produce Hamlet, right? And yet, no, they really believe that. And you could point out the monkey will run out of food and water and ink and paper is what will actually happen. And plus the monkey will just stop typing. Then they'll, well, okay, that's not relevant. Actually, that is relevant because when you talk about the conditions of the earth, that type of thing really does happen is you don't have, like you run out of stuff. Uh, but the other issue is as soon as we try to make it, as soon as we say what we're looking for, there's no algorithm whatsoever that will result in a monkey, even if you keep the monkey alive and have the infinite paper, there's no algorithm that results in him typing Hamlet and handing it to you and stopping. Make sure I say this right. There's an algorithm that would eventually result in him typing Hamlet and just keeping going. But the only way to get him to type Hamlet and stop would be I'm saying this because poking around with various things, this is how I find meta strategies. So I'm illustrating this in real time. People ask me how I do it, and and you don't always find it, but you poke. But if you have to program Hamlet into the algorithm in the first place for the monkey or the algorithm to stop typing out letters until it gets Hamlet, then you say, well, it doesn't have to stop. Okay, what exactly are you proving then? Like with evolution, there's not just mutation, there's mutation and natural selection. As soon as you have any selection process whatsoever, you're not going to get Hamlet unless you pre-program specifically Hamlet. So there's no process other than typing until you get Hamlet, which would take so long, it's beyond belief. Like it's way more, metaphorically speaking, it's way more, like no one makes the argument that the world's in a total blender and now you have this earth, right? Like it's not just being shuffled about randomly. Like it gets trapped in certain state, right? Like the next state of the universe is not random. It's based on the previous state, which means you get stuck in local peaks, first of all. But then, so you either make an algorithm where it's just literally random sequences of letters, which yes, that will have actually produced Hamlet, but it's beyond, the probabilities become so ridiculous. But then once you have that, you have nothing like evolution. Because the whole point of evolution is it's two parts, and part of it is a selection process, natural selection that leads to a type of progress, right? More that you're better able to survive. That's why they talk about evolutionary advantages and all that. When you take this natural selection out of evolution, you're left with nothing. You're not left with theory. You're just left with a blender. Does that make sense? And you're not left with real life. In real life, you're not just typing letters until you get somewhere. In real life, it's based on the previous letters, right? And the minute you start with one book or a random sequence, and suppose you start with a random sequence of letters, and you can only keep going if what you output is a publishable book that people will buy. Then what'll happen? You're dead before you start. That's exactly what'll actually happen in the universe that we have with life. You never get life to get started. But the right analogy would be a monkey types something at random. If it types something people will buy, then you go from there, and then it can type and make some random changes. And if people buy that, then you keep going. as soon as you imagine that process, it's going to go nowhere, right? But that's actually the evolutionary process as it exists in real life, is you have to have a viable organism that can reproduce in order for evolution to even get off the ground, which is metaphorical people buying the book. It has to people to buy a book, you have to be able to read, it has to be coherent. And then it has to have other traits where it works to a good degree, a decent degree, right? As soon as you represent it properly, evolution becomes absurd. So then we need a theory of the mind where otherwise smart people, when I say smart, I don't even mean smart, but people who can do smart things all the time, like plenty of smart stuff, that can at least feed themselves, somehow can get evolutionary theory so wrong. And that's why I say it's not even close, right? If I told you that I'll tell you how to make an amazing book, you can make such a good novel. What you do is you type at random and then you sell that. And then you make some random changes. And if people buy it more, if it sells better, then you stick with that new version. And this is a great way to represent evolution properly, or the evolutionary algorithm that actually exists. This algorithm I'm telling you really exists metaphorically in real life. This is how life actually works and how changes do get made. Like you could make a couple of small changes or some, and there are changes that organisms do at random with natural selection and mutation, but they're all within, you can't get a fundamentally different book that way, right? In between Peter Rabbit, right, and Hop on, or whatever one of those books, and Hop on Pop or Dr. Seuss book, there isn't a series of readable books between the two. Right? You aren't going to get it by random changes and seeing what sells. Right? It's the same exact way, and there's nothing in between a tree sloth and some other living example that either existed in the fossil record or would exist or would beat out the others. And remember, it has to have an advantage. It has to sell better, not just the same. Right? And you make a few spelling errors, it's not going to sell better. Even if you change a few sentences, it's a little bit better, it probably won't sell better. Getting a book to actually sell better takes significant change. So it's when I start to represent some parts of evolution properly, that may, I have to guess, but that may start to, might be like, my gosh, I can't believe people actually believe that. Why do I do that? Not evolution? No, of course, that topic itself is relevant in certain ways, but not necessarily relevant in other ways. And for you guys, I don't think it's like a top priority. But showing you what can happen if you represent things differently or properly, but at least just differently. And it also shows how a full blindness can happen. The way that evolutionists represent evolution makes sense to them. So they have a whole representation that keeps making sense to them. They actually look at, here's an example quickly, but because I think this might all turn out to help us understand the meta. Like what they do is they see every trait that living organisms have that allows them to survive. So think about what I just said. So a living organism, the fact that it has traits that allow it to live and keep living, and an organism that was born to people that reproduced and can reproduce and make offspring that can be born and survive. They look at each of the individual traits as evolutionary adaptation. So again, you're looking at an organism that's alive. This is like climate change, right? Either every temperature on March 17th is exactly the same year to year in every place in the world, or at least most every place, or else you have climate change. Wow, that's a theory that proves itself, right? And then somehow, like every liberal starting point, they all lead to more tyranny, 100%. Even you'd think that the freedom of a woman to choose what to do with her body or baby, you'd think, how could that lead to tyranny? Liberals can do it. And I'm comfortable saying that flat out because tyranny, clearly wrong. This is just true. What I'm saying, it's not an opinion or political viewpoint. What in actual political practice, what are the actual laws and regulations about abortion? I was thinking about this the other day. It's always funding, which is tyranny. It's always more extortion. What's the first thing Clinton did? Funding for international groups that do abortion. Funding, tyranny. Somehow there's always more money and more power for the few people in control of the government. No matter what the temperature changes from year to year. And that means more power and more money for the people in charge of government. At some point, that's more than a coincidence. Wait a second, maybe there's a problem with the swamp. Like maybe there's a problem with the worldview. So always, no matter what you start, you end up with tyranny, right? The What if you don't want tyranny, where you're trying to start with is something libertarian, if you're trying to be a liberal and you think that's right, and it's mainly because you hate conservatism or whatever, just be a libertarian. Okay. Come on. At some point when everything, and again, I'm saying this is invisible because it's in the background. It's every single one of the arguments leads to tyranny. And so if you're, and we live in such a tyranny, we're told we live in a free country. Yeah. Yeah. We live in such a tyranny. And how do we see that it's a tyranny? Here's a fascinating thing. We have this picture in our minds that's more powerful, again, than the reality would be otherwise if we didn't have the filter. And all this can give you examples of how these filters work. But while I'm on a roll, I'll just go with it for a few minutes. People look at America and they don't see a tyranny, which is extraordinary to me, but they don't. But I remember, because I didn't either when I was younger. But what do? We have a picture of what a tyranny looks like. It's like this has to be this dictator, and it has this whole mental picture that looks like Cuba or something, right? And since we don't look like that, then we're not a tyranny. And then if we think, well, the fascinating question is, say, suppose that people were totally controlled except they could choose when to blink their eyelids. Is that not a tyranny? So my point of saying that is what people will do is point out freedoms that we have as evidence that we don't have a tyranny. But you don't find tyranny by looking for freedoms, because no matter, in Cuba, people could decide all sorts of stuff. You can come up with a bazillion freedoms that they have, right? They can choose when to scratch their back, right? They have an itch on their face like I do. They can scratch it, right? But we would certainly call it a tyranny, right? Or come up with whatever tyranny place that's most a tyranny to you or works well. I don't care if it's Cuba or what, right? But just because you can spot some freedoms doesn't make it not a tyranny, right? What makes something a tyranny, of course, first of all, it's a continuum, right? But again, are individual property rights trampled on? The U.S. government literally owns your body. You're a slave whenever they want you to be legally. They can make you go anywhere. They can lock you up without you committing a real crime or anything like that, or even a legal crime. You don't need to, right? For contempt of court, you show up in a courtroom, that judge is like a metaphorical God with lowercase g or whatever, but they can put you in jail for contempt for your life with no trial, nothing. Okay. And the government can force you to can force you legally into a courtroom, right? For jury duty or whatever, or various reasons. They can indict you just because you're under suspicion. You don't have to do anything wrong, right? So they own your body. They own all of your money, right? Because they can decide to take any of it. The state, the local government, even a homeowners association could like jack up fees wherever they want, weirdly enough. So whether there's a limitation or not. But in the US, your body and all of your property is owned by the government. You own none of it. In practice, you can spend some of it or control some of it, but they can take it away from you legally anytime they decide to. And if they pass laws, they can put the tax rate at 100%. And you don't need a tax rate at 100% to actually make you pay all your money. The tax rate can be at what it is now, and you have to pay estimated taxes on what you made last year. You have to take it out of your business and so forth. You have to have made it yet, right? On June, in a couple of days, you have to pay estimated tax on the second quarter based on what you made last year, basically, and about what you might make this year. But the second quarter's not even over. And you have to pay 40% of it or whatever you make, depending on how much you make. But I had the same sense of, I named the top tax rate as the actual tax rate because that's what all of us are limited by, right? Like if women couldn't rise above a certain station in life of some sort, then even if you were below that station now, it would still be a cap on you, right? It would still be anyway, the tax rate, regardless, when I had the same view towards taxes when I was making $10,000 a year. Anyway, so and then the state can tax you what they want, and states you don't live in could try to come after you, right? We don't think about that usually. But anyway, we live in a tyranny, and I call that a full tyranny, when they own all of your property and your body, and they act like it, and they take advantage of that. There's a draft. It was humiliating because I recognized what it meant. And when I was 18, I had to sign submission to a group of strange men and women that they owned my body and I didn't. There was a sickening thing to it. It's so sick. And it's only men. I think it's only men right now. but it's horrific. You sign that they own your body and you don't when you sign up for this to the draft, selective service or whatever. Maybe it's not technically called a draft right now, but it's like a pre-draft. It's like you're there if they decide to draft you, they remind you they own you. Send me off in front of a cannon anytime they decide they own my son. They can do that to my son. Abraham Lincoln did. FDR did, and all kinds of other people did. Plus, these kids are impressionable at that age, and so they get them now. Or they make kids sign, this is my niece and nephew. They're going to join the armed forces. They get them when people are crazy when they're that age, but they get them to sign away their life. Anyway, but people don't see tyranny when they look at the United States, but I do. And then it's a question, and people really believe it's not a tyranny. And it's purely a question of categories, filters, these things, right? And if you buy what I said, and I think it's at some point it just becomes, what's your definition of tyranny? If the government doesn't own everything you have, and they take plenty of it, right? They do the equivalent of burning, I don't know about you, but about the same for all of us, right? The reason I get up in arms about taxes, it's not about me. I personalize it to make it more compelling, if that makes sense. But it's happening to everyone. If it's just happening to me, it wouldn't matter enough, right, for me to worry about it. I just worry about something else. But there's a way that it affects all of us so deeply. When we're all extorting each other, it's just, right, and not all of us extorting. Setting our kids to do an apprenticeship with an extortionist, that's sick, right? To teach them to normalize that. But anyway, and it matters. The ripple effects are tremendous. Again, it's the kind of thing that looks like it doesn't matter. It's one of my proofs about meta strategy, why it's so invisible to people. How is it not obvious to everyone? But 40% plus state tax and plus sales tax and real estate tax, they do the equivalent of burning my house down every year. For years and years, I used to live in a $200,000 house, and I live in a $700,000 or $800,000 house. And until I stopped working, it's like every year they burn my house down like I have no insurance. That's like major, right? That's not a small thing. This isn't like people that have these things in their head where they're upset about government and they're like weird. They're like hysterical about stuff that just doesn't actually happen, right? They worry. But this is like real stuff. Okay, come back out of that. Julie said, so were the potheads no longer attracted to working with you once you stepped up your integrity? I'm assuming you are prepared to let go of them. Oh, yeah, I mostly created a space where we weren't working with those people exactly anymore, and just a space to deal with that. It was more like, yeah, like basically we become invisible to each other. If you're not smoking pot, then you're not networking with them at the meeting, at the networking of stuff that they care about, like at night at some of these events, and they have their room and they smoke pot. And then you just end up not seeing each other. Just like in dating, when you have certain filters, and in dating, I'm not making a value judgment. Maybe with the pot, there's an inherent one, but I'm really not there. In terms of the backstabbing, there's an inherent value judgment there, but try to get past that. That's not what I mean to have in there. I just picked an example with the integrity, with the work that inherently had a value, at least within, if the value judgment is still within a sphere or a specialization of doing online business and wanting it to just not involve a bunch of people that are just backstabby, crappy all the time. But like when you can see it with dating and it has less of the value judgment in it, and if you see one, there isn't one in this, is what I'm saying, where you literally just don't even see whole groups of potential dating partners in a sense, right? You don't contact them. You skip over their profiles if it's online dating without even realizing it. And even if you start with them, you just don't click a certain way. So you don't really try. You just don't tend to. It's like the receptor picture I've used before with cells in your blood. And that's how cells work with hormones and so forth, is there's receptors shaped a certain way and they just only attach to certain things. And so it ends up looking like a magnet, but magnets don't function like people picture. So maybe that addresses that a little bit. Seeing a thing not just on the surface, Megan Lee writes, but all the layers of the context is amazing, including that the thing itself disappears when all the layers disappear. I used to think maybe it was like 50-50, like you look at a thing with lenses and things like that. And that's the problem with people come up with theories like that. They get in our thinking. We see the world like that and it seems to work, but I realized it wasn't working. Like I needed a theory of mind. There's a way that I harp on this government thing and these things, evolution. I needed a theory of mind to account for that, including that otherwise reasonable, normal people that you would consider good do things that are like burning your house down every year. Like literally like that. Like to have a theory of the world that accounts for both those things simultaneously in people it breaks you out of thinking that you would otherwise not see. Do you see? If I force myself, so to speak, and this again goes to my method of meta strategy, I force myself and I push you, right? Like, you gotta force yourself to say, wait a second, if I'm seeing a public school teacher or a school principal or whatever, and I'm not seeing someone literally, if I don't feel about them the same way I would feel about someone who actually burned my house down, right? Maybe even with my child inside, right? Like money is an extreme thing. Money can save lives. To say that money and lives aren't apples to apples is really missing the point. There's all kinds of lives you could save with money if you put your mind to it, right? Or at least with Operation Smile out in India, right? Where they have this terrible disfigurement with the cleft lip, and it really makes life impossible for people like that, and they can just die early. And then it takes money to fix that, right? If it takes $10,000 to fix a kid, then if you tax someone for $2 million, that's similar to disfiguring what, 200 children for life. So money has a real personal thing to it. It's not just money. And so if you don't viscerally feel like a public school teacher is the same as someone who actually burned your house down last year and is going to do it this year, and you don't have, and they know they don't have insurance, they just pocket the money. They get paid to do it a little bit. They get paid $50,000 to burn your house down, and they're going to keep doing it. If you don't viscerally feel like towards a policeman or a judge or a clerk or DMV worker the same way that you would feel towards someone who actually burned your house down, then there's something. Now, what that forces you to do is find a way to look at a person who's actually burned your house down, ideally, like in the way that you really should, right? But if you don't look at a school teacher in the same way as someone that already burned your house down, and viscerally, if it doesn't feel exactly the same, then something's wrong with something. Either we're wrong about extortion being horrific, or we're missing a justification that they have, or there's something wrong with your understanding of the world that could be a major clue somewhere that could lead to that could lead to breaking that problem with your own way of looking at the world, might lead to all kinds of benefits for you in other ways. I presume that it feels weird if I say you should look at a public school teacher. If I say there's something wrong with you, deeply wrong with you, if you don't look at a public school teacher and see them in the exact same way as someone that's burned your house down already for a small payout and will do so again next year and the year after. If there's a difference to you viscerally, then I'm saying there's something wrong. That sounds extreme and even crazy, I presume, to some of you, maybe all of you, I don't know. But the problem is what I'm saying, right or wrong. And the problem is maybe like there can be something to realize in your mindset that can be so beneficial to you. Because there's got to be major mistakes based on other issues we have, right? We've got to find them somehow, and they're invisible with traditional means. The way that I figured out what I figured out is by being ruthless with that stuff. And then I had to figure out how to be compassionate towards someone who might have actually burned my house down, or someone that's literally done the equivalent. Again, the amount I'm taxed is more than the value of my house for year after year, because I had a less expensive house, so I'm making less money. But literally, that's how much it's taxed. It's my whole house every year. It's not in my head. You know what I'm saying? But my point is, it's not about complaining about taxes or feeling sorry or being a victim. It's about finding meta strategies, about seeing things that are otherwise invisible. And if we're not willing to look at anomalies in the right way, we're not going to find them. And the benefit to me finding these things is massive in other ways. And plus, I learn how I really should see someone that's burned my house down, because I'm not suggesting we go out and kill every government worker. It's reasonable to do that in a sense. It's just as reasonable to kill government workers as it is to kill members of ISIS. But we got to find a different way, right? If our normal way of thinking leads us to the rational conclusion that we should kill like tens of millions of people, according to our normal way of thinking, if we think we should kill child molesters or arsonists who are going to, because if they're going to burn down our house next year, we should kill government workers in the same way. They do the same thing. And they really do it, right? It's actual, not theoretical. Then we need some way of looking at the world that's even deeper. And it forces that. And if you don't, again, if you're not willing to look at things that way, if you're not willing to be ruthless with ideas, and maybe there's an error in my reasoning leading to me to conclude that a public school teacher is the same as a serial arsonist or a serial child molester. But I don't know what it is yet. And I'm interested in finding out. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but then we need to figure out what that is. But there's something going on when there's this much extortion, right? And there's all kinds of symptoms of something horrible going on, right? Half the country really hates the other half and vice versa. right? And there's all kinds of problems, and there's a lot of waste, corruption, and graft, and bribe. We know that DC is a cesspool, right? And then we know there's something wrong with we send our kids to school and something weird happens, right? We send them to college and it's even worse, right? There was a study I read in the Wall Street Journal the other day that going to college doesn't help kids think better. Like they tested 4 years, right? I knew that, but still, this could matter if you have kids, right? Like I think that people don't think that it's nearly. I don't want to make decisions personally about that, but I don't think people represent things nearly properly enough if they're sending their kids to school's an apprenticeship with someone who's people are not inherently evil, and we could be compassionate towards everyone, right? We want to. It's like they have rabies. If our dog we care about it gets rabies, we'd rather cure the dog, right? But I want to cure people, and we need to find a way to cure people even like that, right? But it is what it is right now, and we don't want our kids catching it. Right? All learning is essentially apprenticeship for their greater context, right? What you learn is the invisible stuff, the scarcity, the competition, etc. But for someone to become a worker for the government and become part of an extortion ring and not see the problem with it, there's problems that led to that, right? And your kid's going to absorb those things. You're setting your kid to an apprenticeship with an extortionist. And extortion is like, again, extortion for just the amount that's happened to me in the last few years is the equivalent of disfiguring 200 children for life, just to me. And so I make it personal one-on-one. I look at a public school teacher or a clerk or principal or a member of the military or policeman as if they'd done that whole thing just to me because it's done to 300 million people, right? So there's a lot of them doing it. Yeah, there's a big group. So you can say they have less responsibility individually, but then they're doing it to so many people that it's a reasonable representation to me to look at them as fully doing everything that was done to me. So I look at a policeman or whoever as if they'd actually disfigured 200 kids for life. I did the math, even if it's $10,000 for an operation, small operation. And they're going to keep doing it. And again, and remember I said last time, I wanted to show you how I do meta strategy, but it's that ruthlessness, or you don't like, you do it or you don't. Because otherwise your mind by default is going to swamp everything in it and it's just going to dilute stuff. Like the illustration with the extortion, you're, extortion, but there's all this other dilution and filters. It's not an absolute filter. So it itself gets diluted. So what people do when they hear it is they the mind makes extortion into less of a thing. Like it's almost irrelevant. Instead of what it should do is break your other mistake. Instead, your other mistakes swamp out the extortion. You're like, oh, it's fine. Oh, they can still be a Christian. How can the church be relevant to anything? How can it be a church at all that has anything to do with good ideas or any kind of goodness if they can look at extortion and be like, that's fine? How can someone be said to have a conscience? C.F. Lewis tried to make that argument in Mere Christianity. That's proof of God. But it's nonsense. He said that everyone has like a conscience and that's indicative of something. But people don't have a conscience. And you need to understand that's why your kid doesn't have a conscience. Your people don't have a conscience in the sense of that tells them right from wrong. They don't have it. If they had it, it would tell them extortion was wrong. It doesn't. So they have something else. And unless and until you accept that, you can't understand people's minds. You're going to keep having a totally wrong view of their mind, and it's going to hold you back from being able to make sales. You have this wrong view of people. You need to have a view where they can have goodness, they can and do have goodness, they can and do have smarts, but they can be totally screwed up at the same time. They can make massive errors. People intuitively have a hard time making sense out of we keep thinking that they behave by rational economic theory. And it holds people back from doing business. They think that people act in their own best interests, and they don't. That would assume that their epistemology was right. And until and unless we need to, again, if you can't let clear ideas break your mistakes that you have in your mind, your wrong filters, your wrong pieces of the onion, then what's going to happen is it's going to get diluted out when you discover something. Julie liked the attitude of meta, look at parallel anomaly elsewhere. Absolutely. This is exactly what I do. And I just did it a few in real time. I did it with topics that happen to occur to me. I try not to harp too much on politics. It comes out sometimes. But again, there's a reason why it comes out is because sometimes it's just necessary. Sometimes there's not the same illustration that I can give you in other areas. Like looking at like politics is not like again, this lens like it's some topic that is in its own place. It's about when people are violent. When people are going to be violent and when they're going to violate others, right? If we look there, we see something that we're not going to see if we don't look at that topic. The place where people are willing to be violent reveals something that isn't necessarily going to be revealed anywhere else. And again, if you're not willing to look there, and if I'm not willing to talk about it, then it can remain invisible for you. It's not that I want to talk about that or not. Yeah, ideally, and all things being equal, I wouldn't want to talk about it, right? When I talk about conversion and sales, which I do plenty, then I get a nice feedback and response. That's right. I talk about this, and it's harder for me. Although a lot of people, a lot more people appreciate than I would think, but still. Okay, I'll wind things down here soon. But if it is not too late to ask this question popped into my mind. I don't want to forever. I don't want to forever it, so forget it. What is the perfect term for the mindset one has when one thinks that everyone else seems to be progressing in life except for oneself? Oh, okay. So not like a term, but we want to represent it, right? In order to understand, okay, so we want to be able to see things properly, which means represent them properly. To represent something properly means that we must understand that it's a representation. There's no such thing, in other words, as representing something properly in the sense of the representation is not all the layers of the onion, right? We wouldn't need a representation if we just could see somehow all the layers of the onion. Instead, we're making like all the layers that go into the representation. Instead, we want a representation that works, including we want to know when it works and when it doesn't. What's the realm in which it works? That was a little bit abstract, but it's a little bit like with the ambassador. We want to have an ambassador, let's say. I'm not really talking about government here at all. Forget everything I said about government. Let's just talk practically speaking. You want to, just in the simple way that I'm saying this for this illustration, you want to have an ambassador from a country to talk to, right? Just again, I'm just speaking simplistically, right? If you don't have one, you can't, there's no good way to talk to the country. Similarly, we want to have a representation of things. Otherwise, there's certain ways we can't work with a concept and remember it. And so like there is a default. You can't not have a default. So instead, you want to start to gain control or understanding over the default or similar to default, not the same. That's not a synonym, but the representation of something becomes a default for how you see it. And any mistakes inherent within it, like the good and the bad, becomes the default. Like, however, it's different than the reality. The reality being all the layers. You can't exactly see the layers directly. However well it represents them for the task at hand or the thinking about at hand, the better. And then you get the good and the bad. But the ambassador might have flaws or represent their country in a flawed way, but no ambassador isn't an option either. And anyway, so we want to understand about representation. But then, so what Bryce is asking in a way of speaking, in a way of understanding it, is how do I represent this? And presumably, so how can I not see the world this way? Here's what's going on, Bryce, to help start you somewhere. Mostly what people are doing is they're running in circles, and it looks like they're progressing and they're running in circles. I had a good way to represent this when I was younger, and I mentioned it, but like a lot of my peers, let's say, like I went to UVA, I graduated, right? Generally what you'd expect from someone that does that, besides working at Starbucks, is they're getting a job that's like starting out $40,000 a year, $50,000 a year, right? And then that might lead to bigger and better things, or they're in grad school or something. One of those two. I saw where it all led to, and it was running in circles. They make $50,000 a year and they spend $50,000 a year, or they get in more debt. Plus, then you can say they're getting ahead, David, because they're developing a resume, they're learning skills. Yes, they're getting ahead, they're getting more adapted to ultimately a local peak. So they are getting more adapted. Whenever you get, here's a separate statement that's relevant, that it was part of my stack of stuff to mention. When you climb a peak, when you get more adapted to a box, to a niche, to a profession, to a skill, you tend to be more invested in the box being the right box, right? In other words, it's easy to get afraid of the box, the context changing, right? So the more you get good with tactics, the more you want the meta to already not change. You become afraid of change unless you get good at meta at the same time as tactic, like I'm illustrating for you. If you do that, then you get the best of all worlds. It all rocks. Okay. So they were progressing in life up a local peak that was leading to what? Either they're working for 40 years, they're relatively broke when they retire, and they die and everyone still loses, right? The world still is the way it is, which isn't the way it needs to be. So that's the thing. And even if I just wanted to retire, it really wasn't the right way to go about it. So I needed to figure out how to work for myself. And so, and even just wanting my kid to have someone at home and to not have to send them to school and all that. Then I realized if I had a job, that might be a problem because then my wife might have a job. And then we would be very tempted to not have someone home when they got home from school. At the time, I didn't fully realize about how wrong it was, how you don't, not wrong, like morally, but you just, how counterproductive it was, maladaptive to send your kid to school. So I was planning for that or ahead of time, with decades ahead of time. And I didn't even know what the right peak was, of course, but yet I had to figure out like how to even start to figure out whether I was in the right peak or not. And that kind of, I didn't know local peak theory, but I have good inherent meta strategy naturally. Like I was born with one particular ability, which is originally pain in the ass, but it ultimately ended up to be really helpful. It pain in the ass for forever. Either you or everyone else is crazy for the first 20 years of your life, when you're me. And people give you a hard time, et cetera. They don't want to pay you money for stuff. But then eventually it added up and you get the short. For my journey was more of a pain in the ass. Really, I'll tell you, they're running in circles and you're here right now with me or OMG. You're in a great place with money, doing better. And being on this webinar, you're in the best place to get meta stuff straight. So yeah, if there's anything further, just because this is a pretty interesting question. You're welcome, Bryce. But yeah, I think you're just not seeing your progress. That means seeing the contrast in the right way. And that's because the normal ways that you're given to see contrast don't correspond with actual progress in the right way. So normally people don't see progress properly. I've demonstrated at least the results of my claim, which is that I claim to have a better beacon, better method, and understanding of how to see progress properly. And I've demonstrated stuff in line with that. It doesn't prove it, right? Evidence is something, but I've demonstrated that. And then I've explained it. And I continue to explain it. Have I read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel? I have. It's a little bit of a good example of what I meant about if you focus on tactics, you tend to reinforce a meta. And resurrection was commonplace in ancient times. Yeah, but I didn't just say people believing someone resurrected, but the overall situation with Jesus where it really took off in a number of ways. And again, what's weird is there's not like good theories. Anyway, we don't need to battle on that hill right now about Jesus. But the one interesting thing I'll point out about that is that Lee reinforces a bunch of bad meta concepts, even while he's tactically, allegedly making the case for Christ. There's plenty of useful stuff in there, but his meta is interviewing professors and basically government approved experts to begin with, right, as a journalist. And so I have mixed feelings about that book. But there's plenty of facts in there that can be helpful if you get them in the right, if you don't absorb all the rough meta stuff that he has. Those monkeys were driving to San Francisco for sure, exactly. So this is when I was talking about the monkey at the keyboard. It's very important not to be the monkey in your business aimlessly hacking at the keyboard. That's true as well. Right. You want an algorithm that's going to lead to where you want to go. Right. And the thing is, people's plan, thinking of a plan as an algorithm rather than a series of steps, by the way, is good, right? A plan shouldn't look like a recipe. If Google's algorithm was like, not an algorithm, but if Google's plan or algorithm or recipe was like, if a site has the following thing, like it has to be like a heuristics rather than just like naming what needs to be on a website, or else I would have to have the same website, right? They were like, these words should be on it, these pictures, these images. Yeah, you can think of a plan as an algorithm. And the irony is if they just looked at it that way through the lens of an algorithm and then they looked at where the algorithm was going to lead, then one of the things they would see is, okay, I expect such and such. And the algorithm is, if I hit my expectation, then I proceed to the next thing. If I don't hit my expectation, I throw up my arms and I have no idea what the hell to do and I get upset. There's a little bit of a thing like, okay, for that, I'll pick myself up and go back to the drawing and figure out what to do next. But it's not really built on the algorithm. The algorithm kind of, it just has a bubble that says crap right at that point. And then they have to throw out that algorithm basically and start from scratch. Whereas you could have had a plan that involved, it didn't have to be scrapped every time an expectation wasn't met, in a sense. My plans don't involve picking myself up and persevering because they don't hit places where I would need to do that. Because if you're poking around to find bottlenecks, when do you have failure where you have to pick yourself up and persevere? Right? I poke around, I find bottlenecks, I find anomalies, find where there's a wrong meta, more wrong things in the context, or I find just more simple bottlenecks and get to where I'm going. And it's all a process that keeps going and keeps working. There isn't failure. Again, there's no picking myself up. There's no positive mindset needed. Inherently, I ask positive questions and I acknowledge reality, right? Period. It's just natural from the way that I plan. So I don't even have to have a phrase like there's no failure, just feedback, because it's inherent within, of course not, right? It's inherent within the way that I go about achieving goals. Julie says, being able to articulate that argument against evolutionary theory in such a way that gets others to see their gaping blind spot is absolutely revolutionary. That might be a foothold for getting, wow, interesting, Julie. And apparently it works. Yeah, apparently, because when I talked about evolutionary theory that one time in alchemy, it worked for people. It didn't just, I don't mean that everyone, I'm sure that there's people that are holdouts, but the people like on my side, so to speak, wow, like that, they don't feel like I'm just being ridiculous or that there must be a strong argument. Blind faith in religion leads to the poisoning of humanity. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with it, with both of it. Ideally, one doesn't think that I have blind faith in a religion. If so, then there's just as you get to know me better, Larry, and you might know me well, but then you'll understand that I don't have blind faith in religion. The things I said were citing, anyway, you can get it at a different time when I'm not so short on time. Bryce says, goes back to alchemy when you mentioned the justifications for actions. I'm not like the Nazis, therefore we can do this. Is just as bad and is circular in a way. Yeah, at the point where you're looking for evidence, then you've lost the epistemology game. Like you're just gonna find what you were looking for and what you wanted to believe in the first place. And the more you absorb that, the better you'll get with Sale. The more you really internalize and have a worldview and it's not cynical. I'm not a cynical person at all. I just want to represent things accurately, right? I'm looking to make things great. I think there's a path to that. I don't even think is maybe too weak a word, but part of a path is you look where you're at and you look where you're going, right? I don't have to pretend like things are better than they are now because I'm looking to get where I'm trying to get to. I want to see things or represent things accurately and get to where I'm trying to get to. I don't think people are horrible. It's not even that I think government people are horrible. I just think that we can't cure them. We can't help them. Again, I see it with my niece and nephew. I don't want them to catch that mind virus. So what I'm trying to do is simple in one sense. I want us to not look at it as normal. If it does, maybe if my niece and nephew, two of my sister's three kids, didn't look at it as normal, they wouldn't join the armed forces, which means they're going to have to kill whoever they're told to kill, no matter, and that can spark. And they might just have to run into front of guns like they've been told. Or they might be told to burn little children to death to demoralize the enemy. That's been done in the past too. So is that something I think someone should agree to for years to come when they're 17 or 18? No. And again, because it's looked at as normalized, then it's an option for that. And it would be nice if it wasn't normalized. That's not going to save the world, just not normalizing government, but at least it saves some suffering for a little while and removes one block, where we have to remove a lot of layers, and government and extortion is not the only one. I don't want to act like it, it's not at all. It's nice to not have it, right? That'll be one thing we're not at each other's throats for. Go from there. This isn't so extreme, right? It's extreme when I carry but logically where it must be when I just stick with the idea. But the premise is de Tocqueville, right? In Democracy in America, I think it was him. It might have been, I might be misquoting or thinking of a different person. Maybe even with Ben Franklin or someone that said like democracy works until people realize they can just vote themselves more from the coffers, and then it degrades from there. Steve says the government is a big pointing the gun at somebody machine. Totally. Some people do see it, seek separate tyrannus. Absolutely. Plenty of people do see it as a tyranny, but it's pretty much tends to be in the minority. And they tend to not take it as far as I'm taking it logically, where I say, how can you respect a church that normalizes extortion? by having people that are in an extortion ring in there without being challenged. If they would challenge someone who was doing arson on a regular basis and continuing to do, like burning down the houses of members of the congregation, we presume they would challenge that person at the very least, if like at least approve of them being put in jail, which is a lot of violence being done, at least by proxy to the person. I'm not saying it's not justified, but it still would be approving of a lot of violence. Just because you call the police and have them lock somebody up, then you approve of a lot of violence being done to someone. And again, for good reason if they're burning down houses. But if the church acts differently towards an extortionist than it does towards someone who's burning down houses, then where's their conscience? And they don't have an answer to this. If there was an answer, then there'd be one thing, but they just shrug their shoulders. Julie says, here in Australia at the moment, we have a case where a child has been removed from his family because the parents who were told to take your son home to die went against the medical machine and made other choices for their son. The prescribed treatment is killing him. They're trying to do something different. Yeah, it's tough. It's terribly right. Yeah, it's extreme what people can do. At least in a case like that, while I agree, like I would side with trying to be careful, at least you're dealing with, sorry to explain, like, oh, if we looked, one thing I really try to see by looking at things, oh, I thought about what I said last time, I look at things from different angles. I do that in order to see what the different angles reveal. But be careful, just like being specialized with a particular profession, niche in a profession, you start to be worried about or miss what's outside the box. If you look at something from multiple angles, you'll see more angles, but be careful because whatever's in common with all of those angles will get more invisible, so to speak, or kind of the invisibility that will be reinforced. Like you'll think you increased your understanding, but there might be critical things you're missing. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying don't look at it from multiple angles, but I'm saying when you do, just be careful of that doesn't mean that you understand it yet. There might be critical things you're missing. Just like you can, if you like read a zillion books on sales and try to do a whole bunch of sales yourself, you might be looking at it from different angles, but there might be 3 or 4 things you're missing in the background, such as some things we might have even talked about already. Then you can see what I mean in these Crushing the Games that are preventing you from making a sale. And then all the stuff that you learn will be beneficial. And it really is helpful, but it might be totally blocked by a few things. And just because you've done all that doesn't mean that you can't find some critical things in the background. Awesome, Julie, exactly. I feel the same. There are always critical things you're missing. Oh, and so I was just saying that I try to look at things from a few in some additional ways. When it comes to stuff like this with dealing with what to do about a kid with treatment and parents, I think I go to extremes in my mind because that makes things more visible. We're told not to go to extremes. Obviously, I don't do extremely violent things and stuff, but I don't want to perform extremely crazy actions if they're wrong. But in your mind, it's actually helpful to go to extremes. So anyway, just if parents are really beating a kid badly enough, then we would want, it doesn't have to be government, but we would, in a world with no government, we would still need people to want people to step in and help the kid, right? At some point, a parent is beating a kid, they're about to smash the kid on the head and break their brains and kill them. We would want to grab their arm and stop the club from doing that, right? Their hand from hitting the club. So there is a point in which we would intervene, government or no government, with someone parenting a child, depending on a certain level of abuse and so forth. That shows then as we start, and this is a thinking technique that'll come into play all the time, by the way, it's just, there's a specific example of it. But you do that, you go to the extreme and you say, okay, actually I would interfere at some, just like I realize I would kill someone in self-defense at a certain point, or the defense of somebody else. Once you do that, then if you go to extreme enough, then you realize that at some point you come to a gray area. Of implication, one of the statements of it is you focus on what you can know, and a gray area can be treated as gray. What you try to do in a gray area is not do too much harm, but also just accept that it's a gray area. You can only do as well as you can do. At some point, you have things that people are doing with kids where people do have to interfere. It's going to be a gray area, and it's reasonable in either way. And some of those gray areas might involve life or death, and so it looks extreme, but there's no great answer. I'm not saying this is a gray area in this case or not. I'm not going to comment. I don't have a great opinion on it. It's at least a little bit close to a gray area, if that makes any sense. Things that aren't gray areas are like I'm talking about, like extortion is not gray, right? Because like there isn't, if you look at the extreme of extortion in any direction, it's just not, it doesn't make sense. Like extremely large extortion doesn't make sense. Extremely small extortion isn't like beneficial. It's just a little bit of a bad thing, right? If you extort someone for a penny, Actually, that's even bad because it's humiliating. If you say, I'm going to kill you if you don't give me a penny, and you're serious, then it's still a problem because it communicates a certain type of thing, right? So large or small extortion never makes sense. If you try to add stuff, but if you put some of the money towards a road or all of it towards a road, it still doesn't make sense, right? It's not okay. You can't go to your neighbor, point a gun at them, and be serious that you're going to really hurt them in a way that they know is real, and then say, I'm going to hurt you if you don't give me money. Plus, if you don't give me money, I'm going to take more money tomorrow. Then I'm going to start charging interest, and I'm going to hurt you. Then if that's real and I have a big enough team of people where they know that's true, it's not, and if I start adding in feeding some people with some of the money, anything like a real government, you're just taking a tiny fraction of it, if that, and putting it towards even stuff that's used as justification, then it doesn't make it anymore. So you go to the exchange, you look, and there's no foothold, there's no purchase, and it never gets better. And even if I did that to my neighbor and spent all the money on helping small kids, right, then that wouldn't be okay. Oh, we could try to even go further extreme. What if I extorted a person who wouldn't miss the money? It wouldn't hurt them. They have so much money. I'm just extorting a little bit. And I'm going to put all the money towards kids. No, it's pretty obviously not okay. Plus, that robs, I've said it before, that robs the people that I take it from, even if they were rich, of the possibility of giving that money in love. And then the person that they're helping receiving that love in addition to the money, and everyone feels good about themselves in that case, right? Instead, you have three parties, all of whom feel sick, right? Or should feel sick. The people doing the third party doing the extorting, the people getting extorted, and the people taking the extortion money. There's a way, the ripple effects are really tremendous in the world. It looks like we've already gone 3 hours, but yeah, Chicago holds the record for the highest sales tax yet much of the city's impoverished, right? I do think that I want to talk about next time or sometime soon. There's something really fascinating that I can build on with priorities. And I do want to agree with you and reinforce that you thinking about taxation is probably counterproductive, and getting it on your mind might have some unhelpful ripple effects. It happens to me. And I keep having this sense that there's not like a better example for some things. And there might be a better example that I'm not thinking of. And because of that drawback, that's the reason. But it's not like a cultural rule. I don't want to talk about politics, but I agree. I don't want to get it on your mind as like a competing priority with what you're working on that might be more urgent. Overall, it's a major bottleneck that really matters in our world. And that's why I'm thinking about it. And so it's interesting to me for that reason. I'm really working on it. I'm not complaining about it. I'm working about it. And if it sounds like complaining, that's an example like I gave about the business plan early on, when acknowledging reality or looking at bottlenecks looks like negative thinking. So if it looks like what I'm doing is negative thinking, then that's a mistake about understanding how to look for bottlenecks and focus on them. However, I'm not implying, and if I'm forcing it on you by triggering it for you, that it should be a priority. That would be incorrect. Okay. So it's correct in one sense for me to talk about it in a number of ways, but it's not correct in the sense of if I'm implying you should be thinking about it as a priority. And to not have it be a priority, you can think it through where, look, the bang per buck on you working right now on fixing taxation is probably not there, right? If you spend a few hours doing that and thinking about it, whereas if you spend that same thinking time and focus on creativity and emotional effort and so forth on your business, that's probably going to give you more bang per buck. And maybe one day I'll realize that there was a better way, but I didn't know it yet. To use a different example, it wouldn't even put it on your mind. Because of you, David, I've seen this situation drastically different. I have a friend that clearly made a mistake with an obscure taxation law. It was proven in court that it was a mistake, not a crime. The judge stated that he had to sentence him to federal prison. Oh my goodness, I didn't know if there was an intent you could do that for 1 year and 1 day, even though the judge recommended he should not go to prison. Oh, because of the 3 strikes. That's not the same as 3 strikes, but that's an example of what I mean by these. But weirdly enough, even though the whole idea of judges and the way that they're done is sick, giving them discretion is generally better than not giving discretion, weirdly enough. Once you have the rest of the screwed up situation, then you probably want to give them discretion rather than not. Because if you, David, I had seen this situation drastically different. Yeah, it's crazy. And yet a lot of people feel like that, like they did something wrong. Like people feel like Wesley Snipes did something wrong. Like really wrong. If that makes sense. Reminds me of the Joe Rogan joke. If you go to jail for tax evasion, you're living off taxes. There you go. He did pay, but due to a law, he's now paying even more. Yeah. Jennifer says, really great insights today, pulling things together nicely. By the way, I think it's only $250 for a small share operation. So it's even worse, right? Just that even more kids are being, being deprived. Yeah. Yeah. So great for my son as well in school. I'm also the mixed feelings about how much I harp on sending your kid to school. I know how hard can be for people and how out of position you can be. I remember you separately, you don't want to feel guilty about things or like wrong. There's things you can't change, right? In the moment, and your kid has a say to what they do or can or even should, right? I think it's somewhat complex in a sense. But what isn't complex is the drawbacks. The drawbacks are not a conclusion, right? There's other factors that might be in play where overall there's not much you can do right now. But the cons are cons. The cons are not a conclusion, right? And again, you don't do a conclusion by adding up pros and cons anyway, but you should be aware so that you can know. And I'll try to explain that further here. I just said about pros and cons. Extortion crowds out love, right? Yeah, exactly. That's why God has things the way that God does. People think that God's allowing for all sorts of stuff, but the problem is you try to fix things too much. If you're God, then you crowd out the potential for love. David, I so enjoy these sessions. It's like I spent the week looking through the window. Then you come over and open the door. Oh, you're welcome, Justin. Thanks for the navigation aids and shift in perception. Play the onion and the monkey. Good stuff. I could entitle this webinar The Onion and the Monkey. You're welcome, friend. You're welcome, Joseph. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, rock and roll. Thanks, guys. Wonderful participation and discussion as always. And we had the onion. We had, so one of the big ones is that we want to develop this idea of things disappear. Things don't cause stuff, except we can represent them that way in a way that's useful as long as we understand how we're doing that. We want to understand the nature of how representation works, which is like the nature of seeing. Okay, it relates to the nature of concluding. How we see affects the default of how we conclude what we think is true. So it's an important part of, we don't overcome default, right? Default is always there like a current. You don't overcome a current. You can paddle against it. Like you don't stop a current from being a current. And so you work with it, you work against it, but you don't beat it. You might paddle against the current to get somewhere successfully, but a current is still a current, and understanding the currents is still very important. You're very welcome, guys. Very welcome. Thank you guys. A lot of thanks. I appreciate it. It's always tough talking about government a little bit more than I usually plan on, but maybe I wish I hadn't, but either way. And maybe again, maybe it's the only way. Not so much the only way about government, but the only way to illustrate a certain ruthlessness that, as far as I understand, is necessary for breaking our meta in ways that we will benefit. Like we need to see things that we don't see because they're in the background, and we find a way to them sometimes through analogies, right? And not analogies, anomalies that are parallel. We find a meta in some other area of life we don't expect, just like a comedian can find humor throughout the day. He doesn't go to a restaurant to look for humor. He just goes, and while he's eating, he might see something that could be a funny joke. And that's how you can live your life with meta stuff. Very welcome to the Charles Scott. And then we had the very interesting practical potential thing about our view towards accepting money. And I related that to what we talked about last time, right? About really seeing it as what we have to deliver what other people value, not what they should value, not what we project that they value, not because it inherently has value or not. It's triggered in their mind. And once you look at things that way, it's actually probably a lot easier to ask for the money because you both feel that they value it and you're sacrificing in a sense because you're having to subsume what you think is valuable. And plus, we generally have a kind of a category in our mind for things that are truly good and truly valuable. And we almost feel like we shouldn't charge for them, which isn't even wrong. I feel the same way. Like, I feel like this information I'm sharing with you has to be shared. And therefore I'm reluctant to charge for it in a certain way. Right? Even when I do, I kind of want to get to where I don't. And I like it well when I don't. And so we don't want to put stuff that we're selling in that same category and stuff that's truly good, believe it or not. And then how do you get the best of both worlds? You do the best you can to help people within the parameter, the boundary, the foothold that starts with them of what they value. You start there. And as long as you start there, it fixes all the problems with kind of asking for the money and also realizing what you can ask for money for and having someone say, yeah. But you can ask it with congruent. And I also pointed out some examples with the percentage of what they might already be spending on ad spend might be an easier thing for them to value. Then you can try to help them from there. But because you're starting with what they value, that's enough of a pain in the ass right there that you feel more willing to charge money kind of thing. But unless something's a bit of a pain in your own ass, so to speak, then it's literally easier to charge money when something's a bit of a pain in your ass, right? You don't manufacture pain in your own ass, but again, there's a natural one there that you can't. So that could be very helpful for those of you who have that in your meta, and you can start to see it. And maybe we'll discuss that further. Maybe it'll open people's eyes and I'll think of some things or whatever. But that's a big takeaway too. All right, guys, wonderful. Appreciate you all. And I'll end the webinar here.